The ongoing tension between China and the Philippines reached a potentially dangerous tipping point recently when a Philippine vessel carrying supplies to a military outpost on Ayungin Shoal, also known as Second Thomas Shoal in the Spratly Islands, briefly collided with a Chinese Coast Guard vessel that was attempting to block its path. Philippine authorities have readily claimed that the Chinese vessel had been conducting a series of reckless blocking maneuvers, making them responsible for the relatively minor collision. Chinese authorities, on the other hand, are placing the full blame on the Filipino ship, who they're claiming entered an area of the South China Sea that belongs to China illegally. Yet this shoal resides in waters internationally recognized to belong to the Philippines. To paint a picture for you, the Ayungin Shoal consists of a sunken World War II-era landing ship named the BPS Sierra Madre that was intentionally run aground back in 1999 in an effort to stifle China's expanding foothold in the area. But this was not a unique occurrence. The confrontation between Manila and Beijing over submerged shoals in the South China Sea has been going on for decades. In recent months, however, these altercations at sea have gathered global attention, largely thanks to television and online media. And all of this has notably increased the ongoing tension between China and the United States, who has had a long-standing mutual defense agreement with the Philippines. This agreement states, along with other provisions, that if either country were to be attacked, especially in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea as it's called in Manila, the other would come to their defense. With the world now watching closely, it's hard to say how the US will react to this event. Only a month prior to this recent collision, the Philippine Coast Guard released a video of a diver cutting a floating barrier that had been installed by the Chinese to keep fishing boats and other vessels out of this disputed zone. The Philippine government, in fact, has been regularly feeding videos to the media, as well as taking journalists, including some from the BBC, aboard its boats and aircraft that are operating in disputed waters. These actions have been perceived, particularly by China, as part of a deliberate campaign by the Philippine government to shine a spotlight on aggressive interactions that have been happening regularly for quite some time in this area of the South China Sea, which covers nearly 2.1 million square kilometers. The dispute over much of the region, along with the islands and the sandbars within it, including many features that are hundreds of kilometers away from the Chinese mainland, should have come to an end after the International Tribunal located in The Hague, Netherlands, made a significant decision in regards to this long-standing maritime dispute between the Philippines and China back in 2016. This ruling, by what is officially known as the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, sent shockwaves across the region, many of which were felt by the rest of the world. It stated that China did not have a valid legal basis to claim historic rights to most of the South China Sea. This decision essentially meant that China's territorial claims, which were themselves based on historical records dating back to the Xia dynasty nearly 4,000 years ago, were not legally valid under international law. Since the Hague ruling, however, China has turned 7 of the contested reefs it already had control of into missile-protected military bases. Certainly a lot has happened since the Hague ruling, but there was also a long runway leading up to it, which we'll cover briefly, starting with the formal relationship that's existed between the Philippines and the US as far back as 1898. When the Spanish-American War ended and Madrid handed over control of its then colony to the US, the Philippines remained a US territory until July 4, 1946, when it was eventually granted its independence, and the US has maintained a military presence in the archipelago ever since. At one time, the Philippines was even home to 2 of the US's largest overseas military installations, Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Station, both of which were of high strategic importance during the US's war in Vietnam. In the 1990s, however, after the agreement regarding the bases expired, full control of both installations were transferred to Manila. So, you might be wondering, why all the international interest in the Philippines? Well, it's important to understand that the South China Sea is a region of immense strategic importance, has an abundance of natural resources, and has been a focal point of international disputes for many years, which have led to a number of multifaceted conflicts involving territorial claims, historical rights, and the exploitation of natural resources, including substantial reserves of oil and natural gas beneath the seafloor. China's desire to control the South China Sea is driven in large part by its intention to dominate a crucial trade route used for a significant portion of its imported oil. This is a matter of national survival for China, as it's also where the US Navy could easily strangle China's economic lifeline in case of war. Gaining control of this lane would also enable China to potentially interfere with cargo shipments traveling to and from other nations in East and Southeast Asia. Even more, if China were to get control of the South China Sea, it could then deny access to foreign military forces, including the US. But China and the Philippines aren't the only ones interested in the various islands, reefs, and waters within the region. Other nations, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, have also sought to establish a forceful presence here, as tensions over these disputed territories have continued to result in periodic flare-ups involving both commercial ships, mercenary vessels, and military patrol. And the Hague ruling in 2016 wasn't Manila's first attempt to settle this matter once and for all. In 2013, the Philippine government won a previous arbitration case they filed with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. In this case, Filipino authorities made essentially the same argument that they would in 2016, stating that all of China's territorial claims that were based on historical grounds were inconsistent with the UNCLOS guidelines governing maritime boundaries. This applied especially to territory that was within the country's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, that extends out to 200 nautical miles from the Philippine coastline. China, as they would again in 2016, flat out rejected the ruling, arguing that it did not recognize the authority of the tribunal and insisted that these sorts of territorial disputes should be resolved through direct negotiations between the two countries, a response that raised significant concerns about the likelihood of being able to enforce any of the stipulations outlined in the ruling. Both the 2013 and 2016 rulings should have marked a turning point in the South China Sea dispute, but neither led to an immediate resolution of the tensions or the resulting conflicts in the region. And today, the issue clearly remains a complex international concern, which includes not only military posturing, but also a whole lot of geopolitical maneuvering. So what happens now if, let's say, China decides to attack a Filipino vessel that's ventured into this disputed zone? One could certainly assume the US would jump right to their defense. After all, the two nations have had a long-standing agreement to join forces if either were to enter a full-out military conflict with China, or any other nation for that matter. And in the wake of rising tensions instigated by this recent collision, the White House has openly doubled down on their defensive commitment, calling it ironclad. The US certainly can't go back on their word now, right? I mean, this battle buddy agreement between them and the Philippines has been set in ink since 1951. Following years of diplomatic protests over China's aggressive actions and threats against the Filipino Coast Guard, this bilateral treaty, officially known as the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America, or MDT, was signed on August 30, 1951 by representatives from both nations in Washington, D.C. The treaty comprises 8 articles which outline a set of clear commitments that would be invoked if either nation were to be attacked by any other nation, specifically in the South China Sea, and especially if either nation's Coast Guard vessels were the intended target. Contained within the 8 articles of the MDT, among other commitments and obligations established between the two countries, is 1. The agreement that an armed attack on either nation would be considered a common danger to both. 2. The treaty will remain in effect indefinitely unless one of the parties wants out and gives 1-year notice. 3. The two nations will consult each other whenever their territorial integrity, political independence, or security of either is threatened. And 4. Both nations agree to meet whatever common danger might arise in accordance with their individual constitutions. In plain English, if someone messes with you, they're messing with us too. No matter what, we've got your back. The bond between the US and the Philippines, as well as Washington's clear commitment to honor the MDT if needed, has only deepened under Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., who won the presidency in May 2022 by a landslide victory, racking up more than 30 million votes. The son of the controversial Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the Philippines from 1965 to 1986, with about half of that time being under the boot heel of martial law, Marcos Jr. has also had a long and at times controversial political career. And given the current state of things in the South China Sea, as the possibility of a hot war with China increases, it's probably in Marcos's best interest to keep his new friends in Washington nice and close, which he seems to be doing quite well. Since he was elected, essentially reversing the trend of his predecessor, former President Rodrigo Duterte, Marcos has had ongoing contact with U.S. President Joe Biden, partly in order to maintain a firm understanding of Washington's commitment to protect his country, as they'd mutually agreed in the 1951 treaty. During these chats, as the past 2 Philippine administrations also hoped for, Marcos has been asking for some specifics in terms of protection from its former colonial ruler. What specific scenario needs to happen, Marcos wants to know, for the U.S. to finally step in and use force to protect Philippine assets? In the past, Washington has hesitated to make any specific promises, This stems partly from its concerns that their promise to get involved might boost Manila's confidence too high, enough perhaps to leverage the U.S.'s guaranteed support to advance its own agenda regarding maritime and territorial claims against some of its neighboring countries in the South China Sea, particularly China. Ultimately, though, Marcos got what he wanted, and in May of this year, the two nations added a 6-page update to the Mutual Defense Treaty, which included references to modern forms of warfare, including questionable gray zone tactics, which China has been accused of using, although the guidelines didn't mention China specifically. Additionally, the guidelines clearly reaffirmed that an armed attack against any other nation, anywhere in the Pacific, including anywhere in the South China Sea, against any public vessel, aircraft, or armed forces asset belonging to the Philippines, including their Coast Guard, would undoubtedly invoke the U.S.'s commitment to mutual defense as outlined under Articles 4 and 5 of the 1951 MDT. Elements of the new guidelines also, 1. Address both current and emerging threats in the region, 2. Outline the roles, missions, and capabilities of the alliance to face both local and global security threats. 3. Encourage the unification of focus on the most obvious regional concerns. And 4. Identify shared priorities in terms of conventional and non-conventional security challenges. But to make the most of these new guidelines, both countries will need to play their part in developing a comprehensive strategy to enhance the defense and security partnership between them. This will include 1. Modernizing the defense capabilities of both nations through coordination, 2. The procurement of interoperable defense equipment, and 3. Investing in education and training. The guidelines also stress the importance of combating non-conventional threats, improving cyber defense and security, and addressing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Clearly, the deepening of military coordination is a top priority, but a significant emphasis has also been placed on countering regional threats, enhancing maritime security, and strengthening the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, an agreement that's existed between the U.S. and the Philippines since 2014. Essentially, the EDCA allows for an increased and more flexible U.S. military presence in the Philippines and opens the door for greater cooperation between the two countries in matters of defense and security. These new guidelines sound like a pretty good deal, right? Just what Marcos wanted. Why the sudden change of heart from Washington, you might be asking? Could they have gained some sort of strategic advantage in return? Well, it's hard to say definitively, but just a few months before the new guidelines were added back in February, the Philippine government announced that they would be providing the U.S. with expanded access to its military bases, which would give U.S. forces a far greater strategic footing on the southeastern edge of the South China Sea. China, to the surprise of no one, was quick to protest the deal, a deal that will ultimately give the U.S. access to 4 more strategic locations in the Philippines, allowing for a more efficient rotation of troops among the U.S.'s 9 regional bases. Not to mention the increased opportunity for joint training between the U.S. and the Philippines, as well as pre-positioning of equipment and the building of runways, fuel storage depots, and housing. The real value of the deal, though, comes from the extra availability of runways. China's People's Liberation Army Rocket Force counts on knocking out air bases and runways in use by the U.S. in case of war. But now its ability to do that has just been significantly complicated. This agreement, which included $100 million in military aid, as well as another $82 million to upgrade the current EDCA-designated sites, included an addition to the 2014 EDCA, which in general would provide an overall framework concerning the use of certain Philippine military facilities for various purposes by American military forces, including training, exercises, and humanitarian assistance, as well as disaster relief operations. These recent EDCA revisions are not a singular event, but appear to be a part of a series of high-profile U.S. military agreements with nations throughout the region, including plans to share defense technologies with India and to deploy the U.S. Marine Corps to some of the island territories of Japan. The U.S. also recently opened a new Marine base on Guam, an island of strategic importance just east of the Philippines. The new location, known as Camp Blas, is the first USMC base to be opened in 70 years and will one day be home to more than 5,000 Marines. And why has all this been so thoroughly grinding China's gears, provoking such a heated response? Well, for one, by increasing U.S. military access to various foreign bases around the Philippines, this could quickly lead to a sizable contingent of U.S. armed forces being stationed less than 325 kilometers south of Taiwan, the highly contested yet democratically governed island of some 24 million people. And Beijing doesn't like this idea at all. Despite never having controlled Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party claims it to be part of its sovereign territory. Sound familiar? Essentially, the Chinese government believes that Taiwan is still a part of China, even though it has been self-governed since 1949, when the civil war between the Communist Party and the Nationalists ended. As a longtime supporter of the Nationalists who lost the Civil War and subsequently fled to Taiwan, the U.S. established a defense treaty with their emerging government in the 1950s. Things changed in the 1970s, however, when it was in the U.S.'s best interest to improve relations with the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and so decided to recognize the government of Beijing as the legitimate ruling body for all of China, which in their eyes included Taiwan. This became known as the One China policy. The situation today is a lot more complicated because China is much more powerful of a country than it was back in the 70s when the U.S. agreed to the One China policy. The U.S., who also has ongoing interests in Taiwan, doesn't want to see it fall under China's control, but Beijing has made it abundantly clear that the U.S. should respect their prior agreement and stay out of the issue. The real concern lingering here is the tension surrounding the sovereignty of Taiwan could potentially spark a war with China, which would be a significant global event with huge economic and political consequences, and this is helped none at all by the situation of the Philippines. The fall of Taiwan to China would leave China in control of the vast majority of the world's production of computer chips, giving it an unprecedented leverage over the global economy and potentially allowing it to blackmail any nation it wished. It would also break the First Island chain, which stretches from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines and currently limits China's ability to project naval power in case of a war. From Taiwan's ports on the east of the island, China could also dispatch its submarines straight into deep waters, evading U.S. detection. But despite China's protests and veiled threats, the U.S. hasn't been willing to simply leave Taiwan out to dry, due largely to a range of strategic and economic factors. Another of which is Taiwan's useful position in the Asia-Pacific region, sitting at the crossroads of major shipping routes and in close proximity to not only China but Japan and South Korea, which makes ensuring Taiwan's stability essential to the security of U.S. interests and a significant motivation for maintaining peace in the region. Moreover, Taiwan's status as a thriving democracy resonates with American democratic values, making it a natural ally in promoting democracy, as well as balancing China's influence and preventing any single dominant power in the East. And in terms of economics, Taiwan's also a substantial trading partner for the U.S., a benefit to many American businesses and the U.S. economy as a whole. But the most pressing issue at hand here is not, for the moment, Taiwan. We're talking about the increasingly tense situation involving China, the Philippines, and the U.S. One major area of concern for Manila, and therefore Washington, has been China's increased use of so-called gray zone tactics against vessels operating in the contested zone of the South China Sea, as well as other military and governmental assets. Gray zone tactics are loosely defined as coercive actions that fall short of armed conflict but clearly go beyond normal diplomatic or economic activities, which can include but aren't limited to geopolitical, economic, military, and cyber operations. And China has not been shy about using these questionable maneuvers to advance its domestic, economic, foreign policy, and security objectives. They are, as we take a closer look, referred to as gray zone tactics for good reason, given there's currently no consensus among U.S. government officials, experts, and academics on which, if any, of China's unconventional maneuvers pose the most significant threats to the U.S. and its allies. Complicating the issue even further, the common view coming out of Manila is that these gray zone activities are simply a natural extension of how countries exercise their power, both historically and in more recent decades. But what seems to be obvious to most of the rest of the world is that these activities are simply a convoluted way of pressuring other countries to act in ways that could ultimately be of benefit to Beijing, which would mean essentially advancing its regional objectives without triggering international backlash. Take, for example, the close call that occurred a few months ago, when the U.S. accused a Chinese Navy ship of carrying out an intentionally dangerous maneuver near an American destroyer that was transiting through the contested Taiwan Strait. This incident was the second close encounter to occur between the American and Chinese militaries in a period of less than 10 days. Actions that the U.S. has claimed are, although not directly hostile, intended to undermine peace and stability in the region. The definition of what could be considered a gray zone tactic is quite broad, but some of the overarching trends that have been observed include 1. Laws and regulations that might enable Beijing to control non-governmental personnel and assets. 2. The increase of Chinese geopolitical, economic, and military influence over other countries. 3. The strengthening of the connection between China's military development and economic growth. And 4. The integration of military and paramilitary forces operating in theater. When this type of ambiguous political, economic, and military maneuvering takes place, it can be highly difficult for allied nations to know when the appropriate or necessary time is to intervene. Beijing is clearly trying to test out not only Manila's resolve, but also the willingness of Washington to stand up for one of its many international partners. This also raises the question of whether or not the ongoing crisis in the Middle East is distracting the U.S. from ongoing developments in the Indo-Pacific theater. If called upon to do so, can they offer effective assistance to both Israel and Manila? There is an obvious feeling of attack when we observe what's happening in the South China Sea, but what exactly is happening and how can it be stopped? In this case, when there's a long-established partnership between two countries like the US and the Philippines, there will ultimately come a time when one will have to rise to the other's defense. And if things keep going the way they have been, that time could be sooner than we might expect. All eyes are on the Russian bear as it marches across Eastern Europe. But is the bigger threat to the world hiding in the East? Is China actually plotting to take over the world? As a president famously said, that depends on your definition of is. There's no question that China is a massive world power. In fact, depending on your standards, it might be only the second superpower in the world after the United States. It's the most populous country in the world, with over 4 times the population of the US. It has the second largest economy of the world, the third largest country in size behind Russia and Canada, and is one of only a small number of nuclear powers in the world. It's certainly the biggest power in Asia, and it might have much bigger ambitions than that. But what are China's actual plans for the world? To find that out, you can look close to home. The province of Hong Kong, which was a British territory for decades, was handed back to China in 1997 after negotiations which created a plan of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would be allowed to maintain its autonomy and run itself as a democracy, while China would administer certain larger affairs, and it would officially be part of the larger country. That was the system for a while, until China decided it wasn't anymore, and the People's Republic of China has been tightening the screws ever since. And China has been through plenty of changes itself. Since China became a communist country in 1949 under Mao Zedong, it's been a dictatorship, but Mao's strict adherence to the communist dogma, which led to brutal famines and repression, have long since been replaced with a very different system under Deng Xiaoping and the current leader Xi Jinping. The country kept its autocratic system of government while replacing its economic policies with a sort of hybrid government-controlled capitalism. Under this system, China's economy has exploded and has become one of the world's largest producers of electronics, appliances, and mined rare earth minerals essential for manufacturing. But in other ways, China's modernization did not bring good things. While China is only loosely a communist country now, their security state is still very similar to what it was under Mao, only with a high-tech twist. In the modern age, governments use the internet heavily to gain intelligence on potential threats. That's true in China and in most other countries, with powerful tech companies turning over information to the government as needed. In China, websites like TikTok contain extensive tracking software that the Chinese government uses for unknown purposes. And internally, China has become notorious for its social credit system. This ranks citizens based on their perceived loyalty to the government and their conduct in other ways, with various privileges being granted only to those with higher social credit scores. And if you're under China's thumb, there is little you can do to escape. Hong Kong was given guarantees of a certain level of autonomy for a specific term, but in recent years those guarantees have been largely overrun. While they still have separate elections, Chinese authorities increasingly interfere in them and disqualify or arrest candidates who oppose the People's Republic's policies. This often leads to largely unopposed elections, and the recent COVID shutdowns led to China getting even more directly involved in shutting down protests and public gatherings. So, if you're inside China, you're probably kept under a pretty tight grip. But what if you're outside it? That depends on where you are, because China has been involved in a territorial conflict near its borders for almost 70 years now. When the People's Republic of China took control, it was in the middle of a brutal civil war. The communists ultimately won, but the forces of the Republic of China managed to consolidate their forces on the island of Taiwan and hold it, essentially creating a new country there. The only problem is, China still refuses to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. In fact, while they claim they're the legitimate government of Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, now a democracy, still claims it's the rightful government of mainland China. But the People's Republic has much more power, and they've managed to use diplomatic pressure to prevent international recognition of Taiwan as a United Nations member state. And they're not afraid to punch back against big targets. China takes it as a personal offense when anyone recognizes Taiwan as being independent, even if that person isn't actually the head of a country. That's why most US politicians have avoided paying visits to Taiwan in the last few decades, to avoid causing any diplomatic crises for the president. But in 2022, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and some other members of Congress decided to make a visit to the island nation, and China responded hard. They stepped up military drills around the island, terrorizing the citizens, and one Chinese propagandist even said the country should shoot down Pelosi's plane. While clearly that would have started a hot war between China and the US, and cooler heads prevailed, it was clear China was willing to escalate in a hurry. But is China all talk and no action? That depends on where you look. While they get a lot of attention for their over-the-top online personality, with colorful propagandists spreading conspiracy theories and trying to meme, they actually do maintain a very strong deterrent against international criticism. And it's one Russia is fond of as well. China's justice system is notoriously harsh, with long sentences and the death penalty on the table for many crimes, far more than murder or treason. And while most of the people in Chinese prisons are Chinese, they have commonly arrested people from other countries for the purpose of prisoner exchanges. When the CEO of Chinese company Huawei was arrested in Canada, it wasn't long before a Canadian citizen was arrested in China on drug charges. But China's reach is growing fast. No one knows exactly what China's long-term plans are. The People's Republic has made many claims about invading Taiwan, and they're no doubt looking closely at Russia and Ukraine to see how that would go. But it's not going well for Russia. Most of the world has committed to supporting Ukraine with military and financial backing, and Russia has found itself increasingly isolated and sanctioned. While Taiwan isn't universally acknowledged as an independent country the same way Ukraine was, the United States has promised to defend it. So any sort of hot war on the island would likely escalate quickly with potential nuclear consequences. So China might be taking a slower, more global approach. China's internet efforts go far beyond an army of internet trolls, and they might just be becoming the world's most premier cyber hacking organization. While they're certainly not sharing the details of their operations, it's believed that they have 3 divisions of cyber warriors: specialized military forces that train in cyber attacks and work on behalf of the government, state workers who aren't in the military but are tasked with cyber warfare and spying, and a group of non-government workers who are likely hired by the government and have more deniability when they need to break into rival governments' networks. And they've caused a lot of damage. Who has China hacked? Who haven't they hacked? Countless countries have claimed that Chinese hackers have taken classified data. Australia claimed that a 2013 attack accessed the blueprints of their intelligence headquarters, while Canada reported in 2011 an attack compromised multiple federal departments. Japan has reported at least 200 cyber attacks on Japanese companies and scientific institutes, while China's frequent rival India reported multiple denial-of-service attacks that may have come from agents of the Chinese government. Ukraine reported attacks during the opening days of the war, maybe China acting on behalf of Russia, and even the Vatican reported hacking attacks. The US has been the top target of Chinese cyber attacks for a long time, with reports of attacks on military, government, commercial, and industrial organizations. Even the largest companies in the world aren't safe. Google was hacked in 2010 and reported that the privacy of its users was compromised. They also went after massive companies like military contractor Northrop Grumman and manufacturing giant Dow Chemical. An attack on Yahoo might have had less implications for national security, but they probably got a good look at your mom's emails, including that extended exchange with a Nigerian prince. So what does China actually want with all this data? Well, if you ask them, they'd say, "We don't know what you're talking about. No cyber hacking here," as they proceed to hack another company. And because China refuses to fess up to its cyber hacking efforts, it's hard to say what they're actually after. While they hack private companies, it might be Chinese-style capitalism at work, stealing trade secrets so they can give them to their own companies, allowing them to produce lower-cost remakes of major US products, giving them a leg up in the market. They may also be looking for key access to diplomatic cables in their hacking of government institutions, but cybersecurity experts worry about a much bigger threat. If China knows how to get into the mainframes of major companies and government institutions, then they might be looking for a way to turn them off. And if they were ever to initiate war over Taiwan or another country, being able to kneecap the US's military and civilian infrastructure at exactly the right moment could give them the edge they need to finish the job. But is China actually planning a big move? If they are, they've been putting their pieces on the board for a long time. China has a long reach in Asia that goes far beyond Taiwan and Hong Kong. They unilaterally claim sovereignty over the entire South China Sea, which puts them into conflict with Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. China's claim means that they have the authority to stop intelligence gathering activities by foreign militaries in the sea, which has led to multiple near misses between Chinese aircraft and those of other countries. The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines during a recent dispute, and China's response was to reiterate its claims and continue its campaign of harassment. So why does China want this territory so much? Some people think it's just maximalism. After all, if you claim the sea surrounding a bunch of countries, it's really not a big reach to then claim those countries. But the ocean itself is incredibly valuable, with an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and almost 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas hiding far below the waves. If China manages to get the world to accept their authority over these islands, they would have a huge leg up in energy production, something they very much need with their massive population and energy needs. This area also has multiple highly sought-after fishing areas, which would give China the food it needs without having to rely on imports. And more importantly, they would control access to the food of many poorer countries who would have no choice but to align with them. And when you can't find a beachhead, why not make one? China has been known to take over small islands in the South China Sea, but they've started taking another approach, building artificial islands in the South China Sea that let them create unchallenged military staging grounds. These islands are typically built on rocks or reefs that are close to the surface of the water. After dredging the area to create a more solid floor, they're covered with harder material and turned into small military bases. This turns the disputed sea area into what's de facto Chinese territory and serves as an act of intimidation against any other country that tries to set foot in the area. But is China a threat to the region? So far, China seems to be trying to win through soft power rather than open military action. They're hands down the biggest military power in the region, which means that any other country is likely to back down when directly challenged. While North Korea and India are also nuclear powers, North Korea is typically aligned with China, and India is preoccupied by its conflict with Pakistan. China's tensest relations in the region are with Vietnam, which it fought wars with previously. Now the two communist countries have hit rough waters, with China increasingly encroaching on Vietnam's coastline in the South China Sea while harassing Vietnamese ships. In 2014, China began building an oil rig deep within Vietnam's ocean territory. China seems to be making itself a regional power through sheer force of will, but elsewhere it's taking a very different approach. There's no continent more open to realignment than Africa, historically the subject of colonialism, occupation, and a brutal slave trade. Many of its nations only gained independence in the 20th century, often at the conclusion of bloody wars. Now, while many of the countries do have good diplomatic relations with Europe and North America, there are naturally old wounds to heal. And that's why China sees the continent as a massive opportunity for expansion. But this time, they're not looking to intimidate their way into a seat at the table. They're looking to buy their way in. Chinese investments in Africa have gained a lot of attention in recent years as the country moves many of its manufacturing efforts there. Africa is far away from China's expansionist actions in the South China Sea, and as such, many African countries are neutral to China. So when a Chinese firm shows up looking to build a factory there, they're likely to be approved. And China knows how to sweeten the deal. They'll frequently build new housing or other infrastructure as part of their investment, creating potential loyalists down the line should the world divide between China and the US. And for China, investing in Africa just makes sense. Many people see Africa as the future of the world. Not only is the population of the region expected to double in the next 30 years, the highest growth of any continent, but 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are located there. That makes Africa the world's best place for future investments. And China has made it clear that they're not just restoring the old dynamic of Africa being used as a looting ground for world powers. They frequently staff their companies with African workers, providing jobs to the local economy, although they tend to be low-skill and low-paid jobs, while Chinese figures hold the higher positions. But is this good or bad for Africa? Some worry that China is setting Africa up for what's called a debt trap, where they invest heavily in a country in exchange for promises of repayment of the investment, only for the profits to never come and the country to be stuck in a state of limbo. That hasn't happened so far, as it doesn't seem like China simply wants to extract resources or money from Africa. They view it as a diplomatic investment as well. China wants to control the tech infrastructure in these countries, bringing industry to many of them for the first time. If China was to go to war with the United States and NATO, those countries would find themselves potentially cut off from a massive infrastructure network as China had commandeered it. One of the biggest concerns about this effort is that the heavy industrialization in African countries is hurting their environment, but the governments in most countries seem excited for the investment. But is there a longer plan at work here? China seems to have a hand in just about every region, similar to the other superpowers of the past and present. For Europe and North America, they mostly have cautious diplomacy and an aggressive cyber-hacking strategy to gain intelligence. For their neighbors in Asia, they approach with belligerence and flex their muscles to claim territory. But for nations in the so-called Third World, there's often an outstretched hand instead, offering heavy investments and possibly an alliance against the older powerhouses of the world. And some think this might be all coming together for China to make a big move. Many people have said the 21st century could be a Chinese century, with the country's economy growing by leaps and bounds. But they've been hit hard by their efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, leading to economic slowdowns. Additionally, they've lost many diplomatic allies in the West due to their aggressive military tactics and their domestic policies, particularly their internment of the massive Uyghur Muslim population and their treatment of other minority groups like Buddhists and the Falun Gong movement. That's kept their growth in check, with many Western countries becoming more hesitant to invest heavily there. Which then leads people to worry, are they biding their time for a military move? China is incredibly powerful militarily, maybe the second strongest military in the world. While Russia has the most nuclear weapons of any country, its weapons are old and unreliable to the point where no one knows how many would even fire. China's estimated to have only 350 nuclear weapons, a far smaller arsenal than the US, but every single one of them is in working order, and many are attached to powerful missiles that could hit just about anywhere in the world. They're also one of only a few countries to have aircraft carriers, and their naval and aerial fleets are believed to be competitive with the US's fleet. But their biggest weapon might be how prepared they are. So if China was planning to actually take over the world, how would they go about it? The first step would likely to be to plan with some other countries. China has become one of Russia's few remaining allies since the war with Ukraine, helping them get around sanctions and providing vital economic help. So if China wanted to make its own move on Taiwan, or a much bigger plan, it would likely pull in Russia for help. A coordinated attack on several targets might be much harder to coordinate, and they might have a third partner as well, North Korea, run by the infamous Kim Jong-un. Like China and Taiwan, North Korea has never accepted the independence of South Korea, even after 70 years. A three-pronged attack like this might take the world by surprise. But would they actually win? In terms of a full military invasion, we've seen how Russia has performed and North Korea has never been tested against a military outside its peninsula. But China's naval fleet is fearsome, and many believe it could fight the US fleet to a standstill in the Pacific. And when you have two nuclear powers standing off shooting at each other, there's always the risk of escalation. China could not win a nuclear war with the US, but a major nuclear exchange would likely mean neither country is left standing. So China is hoping to avoid nuclear war, and it might have a plan to do so. Could China win a war without firing a shot? This might be where China's cyber hacking infrastructure comes into play. Unlike other military attacks, hackers don't announce themselves. They sneak in under the cover of darkness. Imagine if one morning America woke up and nothing was working. The internet was down, smart devices were malfunctioning, and even the government's connections weren't working. They spend hours getting things up and running, and tune into the news to find out that Chinese warships are shelling Taiwan. Their military has established beachheads in Vietnam and the Philippines, and North Korea has crossed the DMZ. While the fighting is far from over, China has declared their invasion successful and says that any interference from the US would be an invasion of their territory. Surely the United States would arm up, right? Not so fast. Maybe China calls in its chips with Africa and cuts the US off from several key suppliers. Supply chain issues are a bane of Russia in the Ukraine war, and the United States might now face the same problem. China would have cut off its supplies, as will any country aligned with it. More critical, and occupied Taiwan would no longer provide America with the key semiconductors it needs to operate much of its technology, and the United States would have to think twice before expanding key military technology. While South Korea's fearsome military would likely be able to hold off North Korea for a long time, and China would likely rein in the North to keep them from using nuclear weapons, it's unlikely that Taiwan or Southeast Asian nations could hold out too long without support. But is this where China would want to stop? Taking over much of Asia has been China's goal for a long time, and if this plan would work, it would have pulled it off without getting bogged down in a global conflict. This would firmly entrench it as a superpower and make the United States look toothless. More countries would be looking to align with China, and that includes India. China's goal would likely to be to turn India into a regional client state rather than actively trying to conquer it. And with Pakistan on one side and China on the other, they could put a lot of pressure on the subcontinent. Smaller nations in the region would likely choose to align with China for protection, and China's next big step would be to expand further out into the Pacific. Many small island nations there could be pressured into signing deals, giving the Chinese free rein in exchange for protection, and that might bring China into direct conflict with the United States. While most Pacific islands are independent nations by now, the United States has several territories, including Guam and American Samoa. While they're unlikely to try to annex any of them outright, At least at this stage, they would likely start treating them in a similar way to the way they did Vietnam initially. They would just step on their sovereignty as much as they want and dare them to respond. Would the United States tolerate this? That depends on the political climate at the time. How much hunger does the US have for a conflict with a rival superpower? Does the public agree with defending these islands, or do they leave them to their fate? If they're left to their fate, that's another blow against the United States' standing in the world. And the next on the chopping block is Hawaii, an actual state but located thousands of miles away from the mainland. With a strong independence movement, could China make inroads there? So China's plan may not be to conquer the world in a shock-and-awe military campaign against the most powerful armies in the world. It might simply be planning to expand its power and influence piece by piece until it stands alone as the most powerful superpower in the world. The US and Philippines just outplayed China in the South Pacific, and President Xi Jinping is fuming mad about it. Did a recent US and Philippine deal just prevent World War III, or only ensure it'll happen anyway? On February 2, 2023, with the stroke of a pen, the US undid nearly a decade of hard work by China in attempting to sway the Philippines away from its ally. The troubling thing is that it almost worked, and the results would have been disastrous not just for the US but for the liberal and democratic world order. The Philippines is one of the most important nations in the South Pacific, thanks to its geographic location on the world stage. It sits astride the world's most important shipping lanes, which means that the nation can have a direct impact on the trade of most of the world's countries. This is of critical concern to China, seeing as the vast majority of its exports travel by sea. Even more importantly, though, is the fact that the nation imports over 60% of its oil from the Middle East via the sea. This is why China has worked so hard to modernize its navy and now has the world's largest navy. But that's not telling the full story, because pound for pound, China's navy still doesn't come close to matching the might of the United States' own navy. In battle force missiles alone, or the number of missiles for anti-ship, surface attack, and air defense, the US still leads by nearly 50%, though China is working to close the gap. China's no pushover, though, and its new Type 055 destroyers are the most modern in the world, prompting the US to hurry its own new destroyer design into construction. Most important to China is its new aircraft carriers under construction. Its Fujian Type 003 carrier is undergoing sea trials at the moment, and a second carrier is under construction, bringing China's total carrier force up to 3. However, it's rumored that China is already constructing its Type 004 carrier, which will be a true rival to the US Ford class. These carriers will be critically important, because without them, China simply can't operate far from its own shores against major powers like the US. And China desperately needs to be able to project power deep into the South Pacific and Indian Oceans both. Currently, China's crippling Achilles heel is the multiple choke points in the Straits of Malacca or Gulf of Oman, where the US Navy could interdict its maritime shipping. Modern Chinese forces face the exact same problem that World War II Imperial Japan faced. It's too easily cut off from vital imports by sea, despite its massive land border with the rest of Asia. This has been a big reason why China pushed its massive Belt and Road Initiative with very mixed results. America's new deal with the Philippines is the largest expansion of military access to the former U.S. colony in 30 years. The agreement opens up 4 new airfields for U.S. aircraft and grants America the right to maintain equipment and personnel in those bases. Now the U.S. has access to 9 total air bases on the island, allowing it to greatly expand its military presence in the South Pacific. Sitting astride China's sea lines of communication, the U.S. can enforce a blockade of China with ease from the Philippines in case of war. But that's not the only reason this new U.S.-Philippine agreement has Xi Jinping hopping mad, because the expansion of American air power in the Philippines also threatens the most important item on China's agenda, the forceful reunification of Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island is just over 100 miles from Taiwan, and this is significant for the U.S. and its allies in case China tries to invade the island. Any war against China over Taiwan will be one waged at sea and in the air, but China holds all of the advantages in both regards. Its forces can safely operate from bases and ports on its own very heavily defended soil, while the U.S. and its partners have to fly aircraft from hundreds of miles away to defend Taiwan. The closest airfields outside the Philippines to Taiwan are located in South Korea, hundreds of miles away from Taiwan. The bulk of U.S. air power in the Pacific, though, is either on aircraft carriers, in Japan, or in Guam. U.S. carriers will likely be forced to stay significantly far away from Taiwan in case of war due to the threat of Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles, of which China has hundreds, and aircraft flying from Japan or Guam would take as much as half a day just to arrive on station. This is a huge logistical challenge for U.S. forces in the region, as it limits how fast they can respond to a conflict, how long they can be engaged in combat operations, and how fast sorties can be generated. When you consider that U.S. stealth aircraft can only carry 4 long-range air-to-air missiles each, it only further complicates the air defense of Taiwan. But airfields in the Philippines are much closer to Taiwan and would allow the U.S. to more rapidly generate sorties to defend the island. This makes U.S. defense much more credible and helps deter Chinese ambitions to seize Taiwan by force. Ultimately, the best way to win a war is to never fight it at all. But access to 4 additional airfields in the Philippines are also important for another reason. It gives China more targets to shoot at. Currently, China has enough ballistic missiles in its People's Liberation Army rocket force to engage every single U.S. vessel and saturate its air defenses, with missiles left over to target every U.S. airbase in the region. This will be catastrophic for American efforts to defend Taiwan. And in dozens of wargame scenarios when China struck first in a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack, it managed to destroy as much as 90% of the U.S.'s air power in the region while it was still on the ground. Runways can be quickly repaired, but aircraft are much harder and costlier to repair. The U.S. has deployed an array of missile defenses in its bases in the Pacific, but it's still woefully short of the number believed to be needed for even a portion of current U.S. assets to survive a surprise ballistic missile attack. Many American military leaders have been ringing the alarm bell for years, but America's Congress has been slow to act. This is where access to 4 additional airfields becomes so important. China now has to plan on saturating 4 additional airfields and has to deal with the logistical headache of trying to keep dozens of airfields knocked out of commission for the duration of the war against the U.S., an extremely implausible proposition. Each new airfield that the U.S. forces gain access to diminishes China's ability to keep U.S. air forces out of the fight. The American-Filipino Agreement is itself an expansion of a 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. At the time, the future of the U.S.-Philippines relations were very uncertain. The Philippines was and still is a critical U.S. ally, and both sides have enjoyed a long defense relationship. But conflict quickly arose between President Rodrigo Duterte and President Barack Obama. The rift between the U.S. and the Philippines was caused by President Duterte's very violent persecution of a war on the nation's crime. Duterte, a populist authoritarian, came to power on a campaign promising to end violent and drug crime in the Philippines, and upon taking office empowered his police forces to do everything necessary to crack down on criminals. Very quickly, however, Duterte's war on crime became an outright slaughter, with thousands of drug dealers and drug users killed at the hands of the police. Drug users were even murdered in vigilante-style killings, their bodies left out in the street with a sign around their neck spelling out their crime. When President Obama called out Duterte on the violent abuses of his war against crime, Duterte responded by calling the American president a son of a bitch and telling him he could go to hell. Duterte threatened to break up the security partnership between the Philippines and the U.S., saying that he would seek out new relationships with Russia and China. For President Xi Jinping, this was Christmas in July, and his diplomats immediately leapt at the opportunity to turn the Philippines from a potential adversary into an ally. However, the relationship between the two allies remained strong through Duterte's troubling presidency, and the new president Bongbong Marcos was quickly to repair the U.S.-Filipino rift. The defense agreement between the two countries is not without risk to the Philippines, as it places them even further under the crosshairs of long-range Chinese ballistic missile attack. But it comes with serious benefits as well. For starters, there's no better guarantee of national security than having U.S. troops stationed alongside your own troops. Second, though, is the influx of U.S. spending in the areas where the U.S. forces will now be based. On top of ongoing cash flow from off-duty airmen and soldiers, the U.S. is also investing $82 million directly into the construction of its bases in the Philippines. This is significant for the local economy, as unlike China's Belt and Road Initiative, the U.S. is hiring local companies rather than simply using its own. Further, the U.S. has agreed to give $100 million in military aid to the Filipino military. China's military expansion into the South China Sea is also a great incentive for the Philippines to seek expanded U.S. presence on their islands. Famously, China and the Philippines have been clashing over small islands and reefs in waters recognized internationally as belonging to the Philippines. In 1995, China built a small structure on Mischief Reef, well inside the Philippines' territorial waters. It promised it was only a shelter for fishermen. However, in the typical Chinese strategy of taking an inch a year, today the island is home to an entire Chinese military base, including air defense missile batteries and Sea Whiz gun emplacements. The reef even features a runway long enough for China's largest planes. This has been part of China's militarization of reefs across the region, as it used dredges to create artificial islands. An international ruling at The Hague ruled against China's claim of ownership to these waters and in favor of the Philippines, Vietnam, and other nations, to which China said, "Cool story, bro," and kept on building what are essentially unsinkable aircraft carriers. Now these military bases pose a significant threat to the US and its partners in the region, and have been militarized to such a degree that the US Navy would have to dedicate significant resources to their destruction before being able to engage in combat operations near Taiwan. In response to this new agreement between the US and Philippines, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Mao Ning stated that the deal would escalate tensions and endanger peace and stability in the region. In an attempt to counter the deal, China spent considerable effort swaying the Filipino public against the US, and the announcement was not greeted without criticism. However, public opinion on the US remains strongly favorable, with about 63% of surveyed Filipinos through 2018 to 2019 all having positive opinions of the US. This follows a historical trend where the US has been seen as the favorite foreign nation of most Filipinos since the early 2000s. A 2022 poll showed that 89% of Filipinos had a great deal of trust or a fair amount of trust in the US, and the vast majority favored stronger economic ties with America than China. This is in comparison with Filipino views on China, which are overwhelmingly negative. In the same 2022 poll, only 5% of those surveyed had a great deal of trust in China, and 28% had a fair amount of trust. 67% had no trust at all or very little trust in China. This put China behind even Russia despite the war in Ukraine. The time of Duterte's cozying up to China is now over, and the US-Philippine relationship has been righted. This is bad news for China, which has seen half a decade of influence operations go up in smoke, similar to its efforts to sway Australia away from the US. What's bad for China is good for the world, though, as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be disastrous for the current world order. In a century increasingly defined by the struggle of authoritarianism versus democracy, China's destruction of Taiwan would be a significant low point in world affairs. But the threat is far more practical as well, as Taiwan manufactures most of the world's most sensitive electronic components, and a Chinese monopoly on those devices that modern economies run on would mean the Chinese Communist Party would have direct leverage over every nation on the planet. Either do as President Xi wants, or you'll be denied the microchips your economy needs to continue running. With a new Chinese-Russian partnership, which explicitly stated both nations' interest in pushing their version of authoritarian government on the world, the fate of Taiwan could end up defining the entire course of the 21st century. Coconut trees, mangoes, and precision bombers. These are just a few things the Philippines brings to the table if China invades Taiwan. The Filipino and United States governments have come to an agreement that will allow the U.S. to expand its military presence to the northern islands of the Philippines. This deals a huge blow to any plans Beijing might have for invading Taiwan. But the Philippines isn't just a vital strategic location to launch a military mission against China from, it also offers several other advantages. There are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines, and China should be nervous about each and every one. The United States has 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific: Australia, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and the Philippines. However, if a conflict between China and Taiwan arose, the Philippines would be a stone's throw away from the front lines, as its northernmost island is only 118 miles or 190 kilometers away from Taiwan. And if Beijing decided to go full-blown Russia and invade a sovereign nation, the Philippines will almost certainly play a major role in the conflict in several ways. The Philippines would react almost immediately to an invasion of Taiwan, not because they necessarily want to protect the island, but because there are an estimated 200,000 Filipino nationals living and working there. The contingency plans are already being formed on how to bring every Filipino home if China invades Taiwan. But Philippine involvement in a conflict in the South China Sea doesn't stop there. In recent months, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and his administration have been strengthening ties with the U.S. in case China tries to move on Taiwan. In fact, during a visit to Manila on February 2, 2023, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin declared that American commitment to the defense of the Philippines is ironclad. Our alliance makes both of our democracies more secure and helps uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific. This announcement was a major cause for concern in Beijing, and it came as little surprise when Mao Ning, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, responded to Austin's statement and the expansion of U.S. bases in the Philippines. Mao stated this is an act that escalates tensions in the region and endangers regional peace and stability. Regional countries should remain vigilant about this and avoid being used by the U.S. This rhetoric of destabilization whenever China feels threatened or needs to voice its displeasure over the actions of the U.S. is common. However, rather than blatantly stating that this new agreement between the Philippines and the U.S. is a way to keep Beijing in check and act as a deterrent to their aggression towards Taiwan, both countries state that military bases in the Philippines are just a continuation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014. This agreement was put in place to allow for combined training exercises and joint operations that were put on hold during President Rodrigo Duterte's administration, when there were discussions of reducing the Philippines' reliance on the United States and forging closer ties with China. It's clear today that Bongbong Marcos wants to return to the days where the Philippines had a stronger alliance with the U.S. We'll dive deeper into the complex relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines later on. However, it's important to remember that the U.S. colonized the Philippines in 1898, and by its very nature, colonization led to the exploitation of the Filipino people and unethical power structures being put in place. But unfortunately, the Philippines has a long history of being colonized by different outside forces, which is one of the reasons why they've kept such a close eye on the situation developing with Taiwan. If China were to attack and seize the island nation, the Philippines could be next, or at the very least, be forced to become submissive to the growing influence of the Chinese government. But this also goes the other way. Beijing has been keeping a close eye on the Philippines, as its islands and close ties to the U.S. may pose a serious risk to their future plans. Let's break down the 4 reasons why the Philippines is complicating China's plans to invade Taiwan and examine how this might prevent World War III from breaking out. Reason 1. Military intervention. If China ever does invade Taiwan, it'll be a difficult battle to win. This is because the island nation has been building up its military and preparing for the possibility of invasion for decades. However, if China launched the full might of its military against Taiwan and no other countries intervened, they would likely be able to capture the island given enough time. That being said, the invasion would be incredibly costly in terms of lives lost and resources expended, but the sheer size of the People's Liberation Army would allow China to eventually break Taiwan's defenses and secure the island. However, an invasion of Taiwan will not happen in a vacuum, and this is where the Philippines is becoming a major problem for China. The Philippine military itself is not the most formidable force in the world. It only has around 100,000 active members, which is significantly less than the approximately 2 million active personnel that the PLA has. The Philippines Air Force consists mostly of cargo planes, with only around 25 attack-type aircraft at its disposal, which would have no effect against the almost 1,200 fighters China has. The Philippine Navy is mostly composed of patrol ships, 2 frigates, and a corvette. China, on the other hand, has the largest navy in the world, with around 50 destroyers and 2 aircraft carriers at its disposal. So China is not worried about the Philippines military intervening in their plans to invade Taiwan. What they are afraid of is the fact that the recent agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines will allow the U.S. military to operate more effectively in the region. And if the People's Liberation Army went head-to-head with the U.S., they would lose every time. Therefore, the Philippines and its proximity to Taiwan may be one of the biggest complications in any future plans Beijing has for invading the island. The United States now has 9 bases in the Philippines thanks to the new agreement, which would greatly improve its ability to deploy aircraft and naval vessels to the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan. This will improve American resupply and operational capabilities in the region. It's suspected the U.S. forces will immediately begin using these bases for training and equipment storage while simultaneously improving their infrastructure. New runways are being built along with other facilities necessary to strengthen the U.S.'s position. With each new base, China's hopes of securing Taiwan without American intervention is slipping away. There are 3 main advantages that the new bases in the Philippines give the United States, which are 3 causes for concern in China. The first is the U.S. military will be able to increase the amount of training they can conduct in the region. It also means that other U.S. allies like Australia, Japan, and South Korea may also be able to join in more training missions as well. The more preparation and exercises the U.S. and its allies are able to conduct in the region, the more effective their forces will be in a conflict. Being able to practice maneuvers and tactics in the very location where a conflict might arise gives U.S. forces a huge advantage, and this is all thanks to the Philippines. This factor is particularly important for the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Marine Corps Aviation, which will now be able to easily conduct exercises utilizing tactical air formations necessary to be effective in an East Asian conflict. The Philippine bases will allow more frequent training, and although there's no real substitute for actual combat, U.S. military personnel now have the ability to train in the actual environment they would be fighting in if China ever invaded Taiwan. The experience in Asian combat environments that U.S. troops are now gaining is making Beijing incredibly nervous and putting a real damper on any future plans they had of invading Taiwan. The second reason the bases in the Philippines are a major complication for China is that the U.S. can use them as forward operation bases to project power into the South China Sea. The facilities in the Philippines will allow the U.S. military to procure supplies, conduct repairs, and carry out maintenance on its ships and aircraft. This will provide the U.S. with the opportunity to always have a fully functional force ready to strike at any given moment. One of the things that China previously had going for it, if they decided to invade Taiwan, was that the U.S. was on the other side of the Pacific and their bases in the region were some distance away from Taiwan. Now, however, the United States has several bases just over 100 miles from the island, and as the infrastructure is modernized, it could lead to U.S. forces being able to stay fully equipped and operational throughout a prolonged conflict. By allowing the United States military to operate freely and have 9 bases in the Philippines, Manila has provided the means for the U.S. forces to grow exponentially in the region. This has not only angered China but has them terrified. Beijing knows that it cannot win a war against the U.S., which is why they've been using gray zone tactics to weaken Taiwan and bring the island under its sphere of influence. However, this may no longer be enough, and any immediate plans to take Taiwan are now under serious threat because of the Philippines and the U.S. bases there. The third and most obvious reason why the U.S. military presence in the Philippines is complicating China's future plans is that the new bases will allow U.S. forces to launch attacks across the South China Sea and target Chinese forces on the mainland. This would only happen if a full-scale war broke out, but it's the fact that the Philippines will act as a launchpad for combat operations that really has China scared. What it comes down to is that China is concerned about the continuously encroaching presence of the United States military in East Asia. Filipino and U.S. forces have already conducted joint combat exercises and disaster training in the Luzon Strait, the body of water that separates the Philippines and Taiwan. But now these exercises come with a new threat for China. The Filipino and U.S. militaries are clearly planning to defend Taiwan, which will be much easier with new bases in the northern Philippine Islands. However, it's worth noting that the Philippine construction prohibits the basing of nuclear weapons within its borders, so at least that's one thing China doesn't have to worry about for the time being. Reason 2. Economic opportunity. It's no secret that China has spread its influence around the world through trade agreements, shipping, and investment in foreign infrastructure projects. Beijing has been able to manipulate leaders, influence decisions, and sway international sentiment thanks to its rapidly growing economy. China's economic might is its main tool for spreading its power across the planet. However, nations that have closely allied themselves with the U.S., especially in Asia, are a thorn in Beijing's side. The Philippines definitely falls into that category. Over the past decade, China's been the largest foreign investor in the Philippines. However, Chinese companies are still nowhere near as dominant as U.S. companies are in the country. American companies continue to be the top taxpayers in the Philippines and have contributed more over the years than any other nation to its development. That being said, many U.S. companies take advantage of the cheap labor and loose regulations in the Philippines. But just in terms of economic impact, U.S. companies have more invested than China does. During the Duterte administration, China hoped to weaken U.S. influence over the Philippines and control the country through economic means, as it's done with so many other nations. Unfortunately for China, they did not succeed in this endeavor. China still has companies and major investments in the Philippines, but the new administration is clearly looking to strengthen economic ties with the U.S. Manila and Cebu are 2 major trading centers in the region, and there are huge profits to be made by foreign players who utilize those ports. China is now worried that on top of its military expansion, the United States could use the Philippines to further its economic influence over East Asia. The U.S. has allocated more than $82 million for infrastructure improvements in the Philippines to enhance the access to resources and the capabilities of their bases. This is a huge investment that'll bring jobs and economic growth to communities around the military facilities in the Philippines. This is exactly what China has done in other parts of the world with growing economies. It's allowed them to hold power over other governments and influence their decisions. Unfortunately for Beijing, the Philippines will not be another one of its puppets. China invested heavily in the Philippines over the last decade, and now with a renewed alliance with the United States, their investments won't yield the results they had hoped. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Beijing expected one day to control the Filipino government through trade agreements and debt. Perhaps then China could have swayed Manila to support its claims that Taiwan was its territory. At the very least, Beijing hoped that its economic influence would keep the Philippines out of any conflict that arose in the South China Sea. However, this tactic has clearly not worked, which has the Chinese leadership worried. Reason 3. The Philippines is in a unique position to provide humanitarian aid to Taiwan. In the event that a conflict does erupt in the South China Sea, the Philippines will likely see an influx of refugees. This is not ideal for China's plans, as Beijing likely wants to subjugate the Taiwanese people so that the manufacturing capabilities of the island can be maintained once the invasion is complete. Taiwan manufactures over 60% of all semiconductors in the world. This has resulted in the small island becoming an economic powerhouse. However, the fact that the Philippines is so close to Taiwan and Manila has shown in the past that they're willing to take in refugees, Beijing may be nervous that unless they can blockade the entire island of Taiwan, huge amounts of talent and manpower will flee to the Philippines. If China attacks, there will be a mass exodus of Filipino nationals back to their homeland. With them will also come millions of refugees. Taiwan has a population of around 23.35 million people. It's very likely that much of that population who tries to flee will escape to the Philippines. There's also the fact that the United States military will be stationed in the Philippines to help with the refugee crisis and offer aid, housing, and services to those fleeing the Chinese invasion. The fact that the Philippines is in a unique position to aid the Taiwanese people by taking them in during an invasion is probably an annoyance for Beijing. The whole point of their gray zone tactics is to isolate and alienate Taiwan from the rest of the world. However, knowing that the Philippines and the U.S. forces stationed there would be willing and able to help the people of Taiwan as they fled for safety is just another complication for China's plans. Reason 4. The Philippines could threaten China's influence in the region. This is probably at the bottom of China's list of worries, but it is worth noting that the Philippines' economy is growing fast. In the last 2 decades, the GDP of the Philippines has jumped from $94 billion to $394 billion. That's an average growth of around $15 billion annually. Over the last several decades, the Philippines' GDP growth rate has been around 5.7%, which is much higher than most countries around the world. However, China's annual GDP change has averaged around 8.7%. Even still, the Philippines' economy appears to be growing at a steady pace with no signs of slowing down. The economic success likely put the Philippines on China's radar in terms of countries to watch out for. Any threat to Beijing's power and influence in the region is not to be taken lightly. A rapidly modernizing Philippines is not something China is happy about, since Manila is so closely allied with the U.S. As of right now, China is more concerned about the military aspect of the Philippines-American agreement. However, in the future, the economic implications of a growing Filipino economy may be an additional cause for concern. Now let's dive into the history of the Philippines and how the U.S. ended up with so many military bases on its islands. Unfortunately, the Filipino people have been mistreated by a number of nations when colonized, including the Spanish, Japanese, Americans, and even China. However, understanding the past can also help us better understand the power dynamics at play today. It'll also provide a glimpse into why Beijing is so concerned with how things in the Philippines are unfolding. In April of 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. After only months of fighting, the United States Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet stationed in Manila Bay, causing Spain to cede the Philippines to the U.S. It was at this point that the United States declared military rule and the American colonization of the Philippines began. The following year, General Aguinaldo declared the island should be free of foreign control and renamed the First Philippine Republic. He waged war against the American colonizers, leading to the Philippine-American War. After 3 years of fighting, the U.S. forces were victorious and the war ended. A U.S. civil government was installed. In 1935, political movements led to the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. The United States promised the country full independence within 10 years. Unfortunately, this freedom never came, as in 1941, a new colonizer took control of the nation. World War II was in full swing. Japanese forces invaded the Philippines and seized the northern islands. Atrocities occurred, including the massacre of entire towns and villages. It's estimated that as many as 1 million Filipino civilians died during the Japanese occupation. By 1944, U.S. forces reclaimed the island, and in 1946, the Republic of the Philippines was granted full independence. However, the U.S. military never really left the islands. In 1947, the United States was officially granted military basing rights throughout the Philippines. Over time, most of the bases were abandoned, and the U.S. military presence did eventually dwindle. However, in March of 1996, China fired a number of unarmed ballistic missiles across the Taiwan Strait, which splashed down just off the coast of Taiwan. The United States deployed 2 carrier battle groups to the waters around Taiwan to signal to Beijing to stand down and that an attack on Taipei would not be tolerated. It was this incident that led to the United States renewing its alliance with the Philippines and to begin strengthening its position in the region. In 1998, the Visiting Forces Agreement was signed, and the number of American troops stationed in the Philippines increased. The United States and the Philippines began collaborating on fighting the War on Terror. Radical Islamist groups had begun operating in the southernmost sections of Mindanao. These terrorists claimed to have ties to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. However, in 2012, an incident led to Filipino and American forces refocusing their attention on China. A confrontation between Philippine and Chinese naval vessels arose along the Scarborough Shoal Reef in the South China Sea. Both nations claimed the reef belonged to them, as large reserves of oil and gas were found to be located in the area. Nothing came of the conflict other than the Philippines bringing the dispute before an international court, which ruled in their favor. Beijing refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the trial, and tensions over the Scarborough Shoal Reef continued. In 2016, Rodrigo Duterte was elected president and suggested the Philippines rely less heavily on the U.S. and look towards China for the future. In hindsight, that wasn't a complete surprise. Duterte ruled over the Philippines using draconian methods and an iron fist to punish anyone found with drugs of any kind. Thousands of Filipinos were arrested and killed as a result of his policies. Duterte took more of an authoritarian stance than a democratic one, which might have been why he sought closer ties to Beijing. However, in March 2022, when an invasion of Ukraine by Russia seemed all but inevitable, Duterte came running back to the United States for protection. The concern was that if Russia was willing to invade its neighbor, then China might be thinking about expanding its own borders by attacking Taiwan. The concern was that after Taiwan, the Philippines could be Beijing's next target. Talks began, and it appeared the Philippines would allow the U.S. to resume operations at their previous base at Subic Bay and the nearby Clark Air Base. When Bongbong Marcos took over, the alliance was expanded to include 9 bases in total. It was at this point that China began to recognize the major role the Philippines would play in hindering its future plans for the region. It is worth noting that not all the Filipinos are on board with the deployment of American troops within their borders. The older generations remember stories of colonization and what it was like to try to build a country after centuries of foreign powers ravishing their lands and oppressing the Filipino people. It was in 1992 that the last American-controlled military base in the Philippines was shut down. American troops still operated in the country on joint training missions, but there were no longer United States bases on Philippine soil. The reason for this was that many felt like having U.S.-controlled bases in the Philippines brought into question the true sovereignty of the nation. These same feelings are once again rising. The International League of People's Struggle is an anti-imperialist movement that seeks to warn people about the dangers of allowing foreign powers to have a military presence in sovereign nations and educate the world about the atrocities that happened due to colonization. They also voiced concerns that in the past and present, U.S. troops perpetrated crimes against Filipino women and the LGBTQ community. This has included soldiers being tried and convicted of murder, sexual assault, and violation of human rights. However, in those cases, the American troops were almost always sent back to the U.S., where they were never held accountable for their crimes. Regardless of how the Filipino people feel, the government believes that having a U.S. military presence in the Philippines is vital to maintaining the status quo in the region. China knows that the Philippines poses a threat to its power and influence now that the U.S.-Filipino alliance has been repaired and new U.S. bases have been set up in the region. Marcos Jr.'s administration has stated the Philippines would stand by and assist the United States in any armed conflict that arose with Taiwan and China. The reality is that the Philippines was likely always going to be in danger if China invaded Taiwan due to its proximity to the conflict. The Philippines decided to take a proactive approach to this threat and allied itself with the United States for additional protection, money, and resources in the years to come. This has left Beijing furious, and it's clear they now see the Philippines as a major thorn in their side. The year is 2013. Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, has just seen the plans to transform some scattered reefs in the South China Sea into a fortified concrete island, complete with its own hospital, an airstrip, and a military base. Seemingly out of nothing, China will build a base from where strategic bombers can be based and fly thousands of miles from. This could be a stroke of a brush that paints the picture of the end of human civilization. If you think that sounds crazy, you may change your mind when you get to the end of the show. China has been very busy building more artificial islands like this, while much of the world has been looking the other way. China's Great Wall of Sand has been taking shape. This has caused many sleepless nights for folks in Washington. Before we get into the many reasons for the sleepless nights, let's look at this Great Wall of Sand. First named that by a U.S. admiral, the island we just mentioned in the intro is called Fiery Cross Reef. That's what it used to be, just a scattering of reefs. There was nothing there, but then that all changed. In 2013, China decided it was time to transform the place along with other land dotted around the South China Sea. In 2014, between the months of August and November, Chinese dredgers got busy moving a lot of sand around Fiery Cross Reef. Then came the concrete trucks to cover the sand. The end product was an island about 3,000 meters long and 300 meters wide. It wasn't long until Chinese people were in their living rooms watching China Central Television and being told about this state-of-the-art military island from where H-6K strategic bombers could take off. Brimming with pride, they were told there was a hospital there, but more importantly, military installations home to early warning radar systems and various weapon systems. China had created a monster in the South China Sea, and many more monsters would follow. If you went to Fiery Cross Reef today, you'd find garrisons that house something close to 200 troops. Some of them work with surveillance technology, some of them are weapons experts. In 2016, China landed passenger planes there, one from China Southern Airlines and another from Hainan Airlines. This is not an island anyone will be visiting on their vacation. The tests were merely to see what kind of large aircraft could safely land there. There are presently enough hangars to store 24 combat aircraft and 4 much bigger planes. As we told you, the runway is now long enough to accommodate one of China's Shan H-6N bombers. One of these beasts could take off from the island and perform combat operations as far as 3,500 miles away. The planes are capable of being refueled in the air and can fire air-launched cruise missiles. The CIA has been watching the development of these planes for decades because of their nuclear weapon-carrying potential. In 2019, the CIA heard that the newest rendition of the H-6N could carry the mother of all bombs. This is the most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the world. That might be worrying for the US, but it's just as worrying for other countries that are close to the island. This Great Wall of Sand that China has been building includes islands and areas that are disputed. In the Spratly Islands, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all lay claim to some of the land. Just about every single bit of land has 2 or more countries saying it belongs to them. It's a rather contested part of the world, so when China started building artificial islands on top of reefs and sticking military installations there, other countries didn't exactly look the other way. China's been making hay while its economy shines, creating these islands out of virtually nothing and then bringing in anti-aircraft weapons and anti-missile systems plus all kinds of surveillance tech. China is militarizing the sea, which you'll soon understand is not A-OK with the USA. The Philippines wasn't happy when China started to reclaim a place called Mischief Reef. Again, China sent in dredgers to suck up the sand and build a base, and then it concreted the base. What has been a series of reefs was suddenly home to a harbor and a runway. If you look closely, you can see anti-aircraft weapons and missile defense systems. The island also hosts soldiers and barracks and has an 8,900 feet long runway. Then there's China's disagreement with Taiwan over the Itueba Island, which is also part of the Spratly Islands. Satellite photographs show that right now there are armed soldiers there. A runway also has been built, along with radars and missile sites. But guess what? They aren't Chinese soldiers, they're Taiwanese soldiers. Those are Taiwanese weapons. As you know, China thinks Taiwan is part of it, but the Taiwanese would beg to differ. The Taiwanese people will tell you with a proud heart that they definitely ain't part of China. China calls Itueba Taiping. But get this, the Philippines and Vietnam also claim this island to be part of their country. One of the reasons is that the island lies not far from the fisheries and shipping lanes. There's oil and natural gas nearby, so there's an economic consideration too in arguing over these islands. It's not just about projecting military power. But perhaps more importantly, the islands are close to trading routes for the US said to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the American people. China has decided to reclaim many of the islands, so it's not surprising that Taiwan, a US ally, has stuck soldiers and weapons on Itueba. The fight over these places has gone on for decades, sometimes involving bloodshed. But it was really only in 2013 that China started transforming them into strategically useful military installations. The New York Times wrote not too long ago, despite claims of ancient historical links, Chinese officials in the first half of the 20th century were barely aware of the shoals and cays that make up the Spratlys until France annexed 6 of them, including Itueba. China is well aware of them now. These days, the islands are of utmost importance, and this has started to set off alarm bells for the Pentagon, not just around Asia. Take, for example, a place called Woody Island, the largest of the Paracel Islands, also in the South China Sea. Like the other islands, this place was not very significant in the past. It was just a bit of wild area that China, Vietnam, and Taiwan all thought was their own. Since 1956, China has claimed that they own the island. Nonetheless, the mega construction didn't start there until fairly recently. The island now has a large airstrip, military barracks, and weapon systems. It even has a bank. About 1,500 Chinese folks live there at any given time. The place has 2 or 3 artificial harbors where very large ships can dock. These ships could carry massive amounts of cargo, meaning that resupplying the island with weapons and supplies is easy. The runway can be used by bombers and every 4th-generation fighter plane China has. As you probably know, China has many highly advanced fighter planes these days. The stockpile keeps getting bigger and China keeps building runways for them. The US has been watching from a distance as the number of weapons increases. The New York Times wrote in 2016, China had put an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system on the island. Soon after, it reported that Shenyang J-11BH fighter aircraft were seen there. It goes without saying that what China does on such islands is not always open for global and public consumption, which is why the US has for years been surveilling the area as much as has been possible. Woody Island serves as an HQ for China in this area and gives the country considerable strategic power in the region. Vietnam is a country only too aware of this as it's close by. China has started sending passenger planes to the island and folks have been vacationing there or even getting married there. But experts say this is only about China trying to make the place look less like a militaristic joint that it is. Also, by turning it into an economic zone, it becomes harder for anyone to kick China out. Anyone would think China was preparing for war, but let's remember, China is like any other country in the world. Its main goal is to survive. It wants to maintain its power and sovereignty, and to do that, it needs those trade routes. Having power in this area means also having access to oil and gas, which China needs to have for its economy to remain stable. The US, meanwhile, arguably wouldn't be too upset if China's economy failed, even if the two nations do so much trade together. We'll come back to power politics soon. We very much doubt China would launch any attacks from these islands without a very big reason, but it sure wants to remain a force to be reckoned with in the area, as do some other Asian countries who have rightly accused China of breaking international law when it comes to creating those islands. The Philippines actually took China to court for breaking the rules, and it won. This was about fishing and food security in the Philippines, not really military stuff, although the Philippines, it must be said, is allied with the US. It also allied with China, which is why some pundits say it plays both sides. The Philippines asked the Obama administration for help over China's occupation of the Scarborough Shoal, but no help came, even though US officials condemned China's actions. Critics have said the US verbally admonishing China was not enough. Action needed to be taken against China. Not long after, the leaders of the Philippines turned away from the warm embrace of the US and went for drinks and cigars in China's backyard. Agreements were made between the two nations, China came out smiling, and the Philippines was told Chinese investments were coming its way. China has yet to build military infrastructure on the Scarborough Shoal, though. As the shoal is located only about 217 miles from the capital, Manila, China knows better than to put weapons there. But it's just good to have access to the area. Shipping lanes are like roads paved with gold. But more importantly, if China were to have a conflict with, say, the superpower of the world, having control of these shipping lanes would be absolutely crucial. Most Asian countries don't want to upset the economic behemoth of China, or at least a good number of Asian countries don't. That's because they're also survival machines. They're doing what they think is best for them. It should also be said that when it comes to disputes, China has a lot of sway within what's called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. China often throws its weight around, but that's hardly surprising. The US also wants to protect its shipping lanes in the region, so this is a turf war that in the very worst-case scenario could trigger a real war. Every country involved is just looking after its own interests, but China is being blamed, rightly blamed, for wanting a bit too much. Still, it is threatened in this area. After all, the US has lots of allies in the vicinity. Let's just add here that it's thought that the trade that goes through the South China Sea is worth about $4.4 trillion. That's about a third of all global maritime trade. If U.S. ships could control these shipping lanes with its giant navy, it could almost certainly bring China's economy to its knees if it chose to. It would cause massive suffering in China, but it would also cause global economic turmoil, so it's not as if the U.S. would ever take such an action without there being some pretty hardcore circumstances. And we'll talk more about that soon. Imagine the scene. It's July 2023. In a meeting, Vietnam's Minister for Culture, Sports and Tourism is furious, his face twisted into a picture of superlative disgust. Behind him on a large screen is an image of a pretty blonde American lady decked out in a smart button-up dress. "I want this movie banned," he snarls. "I want every single image, digital, paper, or even printed on a little girl's knapsack removed from this country and dumped into the trash can of fake history." He's talking about Barbie, a blockbuster movie that has divided the West on socio-cultural grounds, but one that's angered and offended Vietnam on a much higher level. Why? Because Barbie, as some people have said, is an assault on men, or according to another critic, is a flaming piece of dog poop, a Death Star-sized piece of drack that teaches children all the wrong things. No is the answer. Vietnam could give a rat's behind about polarizing Western world issues. What's incensed the country is an image that appeared in a Barbie scene we just mentioned featuring China's perhaps indelicate 9-dash line. In fact, the Barbie movie is not the first film that Vietnam has banned over this line. 9 highly offensive dark dashes demarcating what critics say is China's brazen territorial claim. Malaysia and the Philippines have also banned American movies over 9 dashes, a problem for Hollywood's bottom line, but a feather in the cap for China. The issue of that now infamous line has been heating up lately. It doesn't look like this story will have anything close to a Hollywood happy ending. Rather, violence is probably on the not-too-distant horizon, which, as you'll see later, has many citizens of Asian nations worried. The USA plays a major role in this existential concern, of course. We'll come back to the present scraps and squabbles soon, but first, we need to look at how this line came into being in the first place. We must ask ourselves, how can China be so bold as to claim so much of this area as its own? Are its long territory-grabbing fingers acting within their rights, or is China being the schoolyard bully of the South China Sea? First, you must understand some history to understand China's rather big claim. As some of you know, for centuries China was quite an isolated nation. It was very advanced though, so when those first Europeans went there and marveled at various Chinese inventions, the Chinese would often refer to those Westerners as uncivilized barbarians. When those enterprising Europeans started to exploit the world's natural resources, sailing around the world to do business and often kill and conquest, China still remained mostly isolated. During the height of the European Industrial Revolution in 1820, despite the British and the rest of Western Europe churning out newfangled money-making industrial machinery, China easily had the world's largest economy. That year, the country's economy was about 6 times bigger than Britain's, which was the largest economy in Europe. China's economy at the time also dwarfed the USA by about 20 times. In fact, China and India at that point together made up 49% of the world's GDP. The British went on to govern India, 1858 to 1947. Some say rob India blind, but getting to China's wealth became a different kind of ballgame. Presently, China will waste no time telling the world about its superpower prowess in those days, but the country also believes the imperialists robbed it at a time when those imperialists were getting very good at making weapons. It's important to understand this widespread conviction in China when trying to understand the country's present territorial claims. In a nutshell, the Europeans weren't happy about China's isolationism. They wanted to do business. The Brits, through the East India Company, especially didn't like China snubbing trade. The Brits hated the fact that China would only sell its very popular products, such as tea and silk, in exchange for British silver. This created a trade imbalance, and one way to get around that was by illegally selling opium from British India to China. As effectively the first large drug trafficking cartel in history, the Brits went from selling 200 chests of opium a year in 1729 to 10,000 chests per year between 1820 and 1830. In 1838, Britain was selling about 40,000 chests, helped along by very dodgy Chinese officials and drug dealers in the port of Canton. Meanwhile, China had an opiate crisis on its hands that makes the US opiate crisis today look like an opiate triviality. The British were acting kinda like a big pharma/Sinaloa cartel of the 1800s. Millions of Chinese were addicted to this old-school OxyContin. A UN report said at the height of the crisis, 1 in 4 Chinese adults were spending their days nodding out on opium. Not good for society at all. In short, the Chinese fought back by burning a huge amount of British opium, and after some more incidents, the two countries ended up going to war. The Europeans, with their new technologies, were certainly very advanced. Barbarians maybe, but barbarians that could easily outclass China in a fight. The Brits by then had far superior battleships and weapons. China was riddled with corruption, official misinformation got back to Beijing, and so the Brits easily won what's now called the First Opium War. For the next century or thereabouts, Western European powers, as well as Japan, Russia, and the US to some extent, beat China up in a series of wars and conflicts that ended with brutal treaties now known as unequal treaties, and the superpower China gradually turned into what was called the sick man of Asia. It lost so much, including lots of territory, China was carved up and plundered. Imperialism is ferocious, Chairman Mao Zedong said years later, even if he was a tyrant of the highest order. China now calls this the century of humiliation, and often you'll hear political rhetoric in China telling people never again. For you to appreciate the present beef over these 9 dashes, you have to understand that bit of history. We only gave you a small snapshot, but it'll do for now. China claims that its 9-dash line, which encompasses close to 90% of the 3 million square kilometers in the South China Sea, is its own blue national soil. The country claims indisputable sovereignty over this area based on its days as a powerhouse in the region before it started losing parts of the territory to the likes of Britain, Japan, and France. Nonetheless, you'd be within your rights to ask why China gets this territory when indeed the South China Sea is surrounded by many countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. You need to know something about the latter. Taiwan, aka the Republic of China, ROC, was annexed in 1683 by China's Qing dynasty, only to lose it to the Emperor of Japan in 1895 as part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This was another one of those so-called unequal treaties that China doesn't look so fondly upon. In 1945, the war ended and Allied China retook control of Taiwan, but this time under the ROC. The ROC had overthrown the Qing dynasty in 1911. After World War II, China, being one of the main allies, was judged deserving of a bit of territory. There were no real big squabbles when in 1947, a Chinese cartographer named Yang Huaren drew a line in the sand, or should we say the sea. It didn't really concern the West back then. China had just lost 15 to 20 million people, second only to the Soviet Union in terms of World War II deaths. This was an 11-dash line, not a 9-dash line. The reason for the 2 missing dashes is because of the infamous Mao Zedong, who in 1952 abandoned China's claim to the area known as the Gulf of Tonkin. The reason why Mao was in power then is that Mao's forces had defeated the ROC, which the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek headed. At the end of this brutal civil war, the nationalists, military, governance, and civilians retreated to Taiwan in their millions, an act known as the Great Retreat. They thought about coming back to reclaim China, but this plan, named Project National Glory, never came to fruition. The People's Republic of China, PRC, was staying, even if it was later weakened after Mao's crazy development plans, aka Great Leap Forward, and his bloody oppression, aka Cultural Revolution, that together cost tens of millions of Chinese lives. So there were 2 competing claims to China, but we should remember that it was the nationalist Yang Huaren who drew the map. When the nationalists skipped off to Taiwan, they still claimed the territory that lied within the 11 dashes that they'd drawn. Mao had nothing to do with the map when it was created. So, you might ask, how did China, the nationalists or the communists, think they could lay claim to all that territory? Surely you can't just draw a map and, well, that's that. Well, China might respond, that's exactly what we did. Often Chinese scholars like to point out that it was only doing what the imperialists in the West had done for centuries. And as you now know, China in its heyday was indeed the regional hegemon. It now says it claimed these territories during that period of strength. China says there's plenty of evidence regarding its historical claims. The country was never really a seafaring nation, unlike Britain and France, but China said it did do a fair bit of moving around the South China Sea. More so, it says, than the other countries currently claiming space in the water. There are the Spratly Islands, a 164,000 square mile area named after 19th century British sea captain named Richard Spratly. Right now, there's a military presence on the 100 or so reefs and atolls, not only from the PRC but also Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Let's now take a look at China's claim. The country says long before the British named this area, in the 2nd century BC, it named them the Nansha Islands, which became the Changsha when the Tang and Song dynasties were around in 618 to 1279. China claims it was the first country to develop some of those islands. It also says in the Guangzhou records written by the Jin dynasty there's talk about Chinese fishermen in this area. China maintains that the Ming and Qing dynasties in 1368 to 1911 wrote about the Hainan Island fishermen in the area, and later they wrote about fixed shipping lanes there. China also likes to remind people that the British Navy Sea Guide once stated, Hainan fishermen dotted on every island live on sea cucumbers and shellfish. Some of them also inhabit the islands. Then in 1933, a French newspaper says China reported between Annam and the Philippine Islands is a group of coral islands dotted with sandbanks and submerged reefs which voyagers see as perilous and not dare enter rashly. There's also thick growth of grass, and some Chinese people from Hainan live on the islands engaging in fishing. On top of that, China says that the Cheng He navigational charts written by the Ming Dynasty record activity on the Nansha Islands. It says there are two Qing Dynasty maps, one dated 1716 and another 1817, which both include these islands. A Chinese website edited by Wang Xiaohua, Vice Minister of the Central Propaganda Department of the Chinese Communist Party, wrote, in 1883, Germany stopped its invasion activities on the Nansha Islands in the face of protests from the Qing government. In 1933, French occupation of the Nansha Islands met with resistance from Chinese fishermen, after which the Chinese government made firm its claim to the territory, which resulted in France's eventual retreat. China says in 1946 the Chinese government, according to the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation, regained its sovereignty over the South China Sea islands and reefs and re-erected a monument of sovereignty on the main island. China also claims that in 1951, at the time of the Japanese Peace Treaty draft and San Francisco Conference statement, Chinese former President Zhou Enlai was quoted saying the area within the 9-dash line was China's territory. In 1958, in the Declaration on the Territorial Sea, the PRC again laid claim to these islands. We have a few things to unpack here in defense of those that say China still doesn't get to claim the territory. Many nations have texts that say their fishermen traveled through a certain area. That's not the same as having sovereignty there. There are even caves on one of the Spratly Islands that show us humans were there around 50,000 years ago. It doesn't mean they had sovereignty. And for sure, as China was easily the most advanced nation in the area, it drew up maps with the islands and talked about them, but that still doesn't mean China had sovereignty over them. Just because you draw a map and include some islands doesn't mean you own them. In fact, as China was exploring these islands, Vietnam was also in the area, claiming to have discovered these new territories. Both nations were doing the same thing. Europeans were in the area too, although when a 1758 map by a man named William Herbert referred to the Spratly Islands, it just called the area dangerous ground, and it didn't mention much else. It's true that in the 1880s, when the Germans started sailing around the Spratly and Paracel Islands, the Chinese told their ships to leave ASAP. And it's true that China laid flags down on some of the islands in 1902 and 1907, but this still doesn't tell us China has the legal right to the territory. In fact, China's history shows us that the country's land boundaries were never clearly defined. The argument against China is that China, the ancient civilization of China, didn't have any clear and defined boundaries, but now it's pretending it did. That's not how China worked in the past, so why is it trying to work this way now, say the Western critics? Chinese history shows us that suzerainty was always China's modus operandi, not conquest with added new boundaries. Suzerainty, by the way, means just having control over a country or territory, even if that country has some amount of autonomy and is allowed to self-govern. For instance, China did have suzerainty in Vietnam, but it never strictly ruled it. Another for instance, in 1770, Lieutenant James Cook, the captain of HMB Endeavour, claimed part of the Australian continent for the British Crown. He called it New South Wales. He told the indigenous folks their land now belonged to the British. The King of England had told Cook to take the land with the consent of the natives, but let's face it, the natives didn't really have a say in the matter. The Brits colonized Australia. Australia was not a tributary state. Right or wrong, those imperialistic Brits did not claim suzerainty. They took Australia and later dumped many of their criminals there. They also massacred Aboriginal people whenever there was resistance to the colonization of their country. Maybe Mao was right and the imperialists were ferocious, but that still doesn't mean China gets to claim any territory where once a handful of fishermen hung out in the water. Western academics say in China there was no such thing as claiming sovereignty over an area. They say the Europeans invented that kind of thing after 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. These nations introduced the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which included the Westphalian system, a system that said there should be international laws and rules, and states that have exclusive rights in their territories. Asia did not adopt the law, not until the 20th century anyway. It's the international law now, but it wasn't when China claims to have done its island hopping. so China, they say, never had sovereignty over the South China Sea islands. Making historical claims based on who was there at one point in history doesn't give you sovereignty in the future. The Diplomat magazine argued that if this was the case, since Taiwan was originally settled by the people of Malay Polynesian, then the Malay people have more of a righteous claim on Taiwan than the PRC. It doesn't make sense to think this way. It would mean Mongolia could make claim to just about all of Asia. Until recently, Chinese maps didn't even focus on the South China Sea. Then in 2009, China had a dispute with Vietnam, and suddenly it took to the UN a map with 9 dashes on it. These days, the 9 dashes are a source of national pride. You can even find them in Chinese passports. China suddenly wants what it never initially claimed. In 2012, when these new Chinese passports came out, the government in the Philippines wouldn't even stamp visa pages and said the stamps must go on a separate sheet of paper. At the time, the Philippines was fighting with China over the Scarborough Shoal, an area where China wants air and naval bases. China's been very busy for about a decade, turning reefs and shoals into fortified military bases, setting off alarm bells in the Pentagon. In China's so-called Great Wall of Sand, what were small reefs have been dredged and concreted over, after which runways at barracks and anti-aircraft weapons and missile defense systems have popped up. This concerns the US more than fishing rights or oil, but the US can also put pressure on countries to go against China. Then again, China can do the same, as it has substantial power in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Just recently, China and ASEAN agreed to attempt to conclude their non-aggression pact on the sea feuds for at least 3 years. As all you historians out there know, such feuds could escalate and lead to a potential world war. Let's remember here that in a world war, these islands and reefs could prove to be a good strategic base. It's also worth noting that about a third of all maritime trade goes through the South China Sea, equal to around 4.4 trillion of trade annually. That's another reason why the USA has been sailing ships through the South China Sea under Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs. Critics inside the US have said this risks escalation, but it seems the US is not going to stop. The US has undertaken 9 FONOPs since 2015, which has infuriated China. By undertaking these cheeky journeys, the US is basically saying China has no right to these territories. So again, these islands meant less to China not too long ago, but now the 9 dashes are firmly implanted in most Chinese people's minds. They're told time and again that there will not be another period of humiliation. Never again. Despite the shaky historical evidence that everything within the line is China's, the people are made to think the evidence is solid. They are also rightly concerned about their existence, which has improved a hell of a lot over the last 20 years. When Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke in March 2023 to the 14th National People's Congress, he talked about when China was turned into a semi-colonial society, when bullying foreigners plunged China into an abyss of great suffering and tore the country apart. The people listened intently. He had a point. China did get done over, but Xi's compelling rhetoric still doesn't mean China has a right to the territory. Nonetheless, China has done a phenomenal job pulling almost 1 billion people out of poverty since its economic boom. It's done well under its Belt and Road Initiative, spreading its influence all over the world. The US will try everything in its power to stop that influence from expanding. It's a big reason why NATO has been forming new partnerships with the Asia-Pacific nations, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. Meanwhile, Vietnam banned Barbie, which, if there is a third world war, might go down as something similar to Hitler invading Poland or Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Just kidding. We hope. Vietnam actually banned the movie Uncharted too for the same reason. Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines all banned the innocent animated movie Abominable. The 9-dash line barely appeared in the background in just one scene, but that was enough. They might not have the same existential fears of the US, they might have more financial concerns, although they might also be getting a push from the US. As we said, these 9-dash line disagreements effectively kicked off in 2009. That was when Malaysia and Vietnam submitted territorial claims in the South China Sea. China made a formal diplomatic response to the UN stating, China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys indisputable sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. This contained a copy of the 9-dash line to protest the Malaysian-Vietnam submission. China claimed the line was widely known by the international community. Then in 2016, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention Tribunal ruled that China's claim isn't based on any kind of international law. Even so, China rejected this ruling, and it continues to do what it wants in the region. The U.S. has said it does not agree with China's claims, which is evident with those phone ops it's been doing, but the U.S. can't really do much about China's bullying tactics. It can't strong-arm the issue. The U.S. hasn't even put its name on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is there to deal with such disputes. The country says part of the convention is unfavorable to its own economic and security interests, but that doesn't help matters where China's island grabs are concerned. It should also be noted that the U.S. did not support the Philippines in 2016. As we said, these disputes are not only about China's expanding military installations. Countries in the region have been arguing about natural resources for years. The area is a fishing gold mine, while there's an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil down there, not to mention about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. No wonder then that Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam all stake claims in the South China Sea. It only became known in the later 1960s that hydrocarbon resources were there, and this is what reignited the interest in the region. In May 1970, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan held talks regarding joint energy exploration in the East China Sea, and that's when China started making new claims. In 1972, the Philippines struck oil off the coast of Palawan Island. There was lots of bickering to follow, and even though in 1982 a resolution was reached under the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, it didn't really address sovereignty issues concerning the South and East China Seas. Then in 1988, China sank 3 Vietnamese ships and killed 70 sailors in another beef about territory in the region. China fought with the Philippines in 1996 in what was called the Mischief Reef Incident. Later in 2002, China and 10 ASEAN nations signed the ASEAN-China Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea to prevent such conflicts from happening again. Further on, China signed an agreement with Japan, again related to energy, and in 2010, when China was looking like it was at the peak of its growing economic powers, the US stopped being neutral regarding the South China Sea. That's when Hillary Clinton said in a speech that the U.S. had an interest in what she called open access to Asia's maritime commons. Soon after, China started building its Great Wall of Sand, and in 2015, the U.S. did its first phone ops, which China's ambassador to the U.S. said was a serious provocation. A regional dispute was now a much bigger dispute and became much more of a concern to the U.S. in 2018 when a Chinese H-6 bomber landed and took off from Woody Island in the Paracel Islands. In 2020, Vietnam condemned China when it opened up administrative structures on the islands in the Paracels and the Spratlys. Again, China just keeps doing what it's doing and throwing its 9-dash line in front of naysayers' faces. The U.S. sees China as a threat. China sees the U.S. as a threat, especially with its new NATO footprints in Asia. Unless there is some serious détente diplomacy, it's hard to see how this all won't end very badly. People in Asia understand this very well. A recent poll was undertaken by the Eurasia Group Foundation, which conducted a survey in 3 Asian nations, Singapore, South Korea, and the Philippines. All these nations had significant ties with both China and the U.S. Read, they'll have to take a side. 90% of respondents said they're worried about a U.S.-China confrontation, 66% were somewhat worried, 24% were very worried, 62% of all the nations said their national security will be put at risk, but 81% in the Philippines said that. Interestingly, around a third of the respondents said they have a positive view of both Chinese and American culture in their country, although some more people said they had a favorable view of the US at 70% than they do of China at 34%. South Korea had the most people that said they have a very unfavorable view of China at 38%, while Singaporeans, only 10% of them mind you, took a very dim view of the US. It's doubtful any of them want to be stuck in the middle of a war, but if the world can't evolve out of balance of power politics, that's what's going to happen. For the second time in its history, the U.S. is poised to lose another war against China. But this time, the entire current world order is at stake. During the Korean War, the influx of hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops surprised American and NATO military planners who were caught completely off guard. While the U.S. technically did not lose against China, in fact it scored truly apocalyptic losses on Chinese infantry, the U.S. also didn't win the war, resulting in the current status quo on the peninsula. South Korea remains a strong U.S. ally and economically powerful liberal democracy, while Kim Jong-un rules the North and hurls missiles into the ocean to keep Godzilla at bay. Sure, some of you will claim there's no such thing as Godzilla and Kim's just a madman developing a nuclear weapons program, but riddle us this: why hasn't there been a single confirmed Godzilla sighting since North Korea began launching missiles into the Pacific? This time, the U.S. and China are set to go head-to-head in a war that will absolutely dwarf the clash between the U.S. and Chinese troops in Korea. And this one's for all the marbles, boys and girls, because the victor is guaranteed to shape the 21st century. If the US wins, the global status quo will remain the same. If China wins, an autocratic world order will almost certainly replace the current liberal one. And if it doesn't, it'll hurl the world into a fresh ideological conflict that'll make the Cold War look like the Anglo-Zanzibar War. This might sound like a lot of hyperbole, but the truth is the US and China represent two completely different visions for the global future. The United States is the dominant global power, and it certainly has its flaws. But it's a train that can be steered and course-corrected, with the historical global trend being toward a more liberal world order. China's very survival depends on upending liberal democracies who represent an existential threat to the iron grip of the Chinese Communist Party. Already, the difficulties of assimilating Hong Kong and Macau into the mainland communist government hint at a China where people are increasingly growing tired of the CCP's yoke. Eliminating all other alternatives altogether is one way to placate the masses. The linchpin of Chinese ambitions to break the US-led world order rests with Taiwan. And unfortunately for the US, that means China has all the advantages. This little island nation played a relatively minor role throughout the 20th century, but it's set to define the 21st century and beyond. The island nation is just offshore mainland China and enjoys a robust, healthy democracy that thrives even under the long, dark shadow of the Chinese Communist Party. China believes that the breakaway republic still belongs in the fold of the CCP and has repeatedly stated it will use force to reunify. Continued independence is simply not an option. So the die is cast, and an invasion seems inevitable. But why does the fate of this little island matter to the world? For one, Taiwan enjoys the protection of what's come to be called the Silicon Shield. Back in the 80s, as the US moved the manufacturing of microchips overseas where they could be produced more cheaply, Taiwan saw an opportunity. The nation invested heavily into building infrastructure to produce semiconductors and soon became a world leader in manufacturing them. With the United States Navy being the most powerful force on Earth, there was little concern over a hostile China next door to the world's largest supply of computer chips. But that calculus has changed, and where once the US could sail its carrier strike groups right past Chinese shores with no concerns, now it has to face a rapidly modernizing and expanding Chinese military. This puts Taiwan in serious jeopardy, and with it, the world's largest supplier of the most advanced computer chips on the planet. With the CCP in control of Taiwan's semiconductor production, it'll have the leverage to blackmail any nation it wishes, even America. Under threat of sanction, nations will have to carefully weigh how they respond to the CCP requests, or watch their economy crumble for a lack of computer chips. We've had a taste of this future with the shortage prompted by the COVID crisis, which for many was a wake-up call to the threat the world order currently faces. Secondly, Taiwan is part of the First Island Chain, a string of islands stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down to the Philippines and beyond. This chain of pro-US nations acts as a barrier and historically has contained the communist powers of the Soviet Union and China. This has left the US Navy as the guarantor of global trade security, and it's thanks to the US naval dominance that the world enjoys free, predictable, and stable trade for the first time in history. China breaking this First Island Chain shifts global power dramatically, as its warships will be able to freely come and go as they please and maneuver strategically important waterways, like the Malacca Straits, where if they so choose they can influence global trade as they wish. With Taiwan as the linchpin of any war between the US and China, this unfortunately leaves China with all the advantages, or at least most of them, because China is making one key error. Faced with the prospect of the United States effectively containing its forces via the First Island Chain, China has two options. The first is to attempt to break the chain militarily, as we seem to be on an inevitable course for. The second, however, is to break the chain diplomatically. Rather than expend military resources and capital in a confrontation with the US and its allies, China could leverage its massive economy and turn it into diplomatic pressure. For its part, China's attempted to do this. It alone holds the leash on North Korea, and it has pursued much closer economic ties with nations in Southeast Asia. This leaves South Korea's fate unknown in case the US and China go to war. Once it would have been a steadfast ally to the US, but its defense treaty with the United States does not compel it to go to war over Taiwan with its ally. With China already punishing South Korea economically over the deployment of US THAAD ballistic missile defenses on its soil in 2017, South Korea may not be looking to break its relationship with such a huge trading partner. And if South Korea reneges on its defensive partnership with the US over Taiwan, the American people may find themselves questioning why they've invested so much in defending the South for 70 years. But with other US partners, China's been far less successful. In fact, it's made some seriously egregious missteps. Once it looked set to spin Australia away from US influence with a robust charm offensive, which came to a crashing halt when the Australians discovered how deeply China had penetrated Australian political and educational institutions. China had been secretly working to influence the Australian youth and politics alike to be pro-CCP, and its continued aggression in the South China Sea was seen as an inevitable threat to Australian interests. When Australia called for an investigation into the origin of COVID, which looked into evidence of the virus being man-made and leaked in a lab by China, relations soured even further, leading to a trade war between the two nations. It's with the Philippines, though, that China's misstepped the most, and it could have just handed the US the keys to victory. Much like in Australia, China also waged a charm offensive against the Philippines and heavily courted the nation's last president, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte was a populist autocrat who came to power on promises to crack down on violent crime and drugs. To his credit, he did just that by launching one of the largest campaigns of police brutality and abuse of the modern era. The International Criminal Court is currently considering an investigation into Duterte's campaign against crime and drugs based on reported hundreds of extrajudicial killings and even more beatings during his reign. Duterte also cracked down on political opposition as best he could, given that the Philippines was still a democracy, much to his chagrin. In short, Duterte was the kind of man China could do business with, a fellow autocrat with deeply anti-democratic sentiments. Relations between the US and the Philippines soured during this time, as US President Barack Obama called out Duterte for the extrajudicial killings that he was overseeing during his campaign against crime. The Philippines and China began to grow closer, and the future of the US-Filipino defensive alliance was in serious question. This would have been a disaster for the balance of power in the Pacific, effectively allowing China to break a large chunk of the first island chain without firing a shot. Even more importantly, it denied the US one thing it needs the most: bases close to China. This is America's biggest weakness in the Pacific. While China can base all air and naval power at once right on its own shores, the US is forced to fight an entire ocean away from its home. This severely limits the amount of firepower the US can bring to a fight, as well as complicating logistics and slowing down the pace and intensity of combat operations. Traditionally, the US has relied on regional allies to give it the geography from which to fight from, leveling the playing field against any Pacific threat. It's known as the tyranny of distance in the US defense circles, and America has invested heavily in neutralizing this significant deficiency. Now the stage was set for China to completely upset US Pacific strategy and perhaps open the door to victory in Taiwan and beyond. But China overstepped and misstepped, both. First, it failed to significantly influence Filipino elections after Duterte's final term, and the nation voted in favor of Ferdinand Bongbong Romualdez Marcos Jr., or simply Bongbong Marcos. Marcos is the son of renowned Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the country with an iron fist from 1965 to 1986. He was known for being grossly corrupt and eliminating any political opposition. But don't worry, the apple definitely fell far from the tree on this one, or so the entire world hopes. Though in truth, it's not exactly out of America's character to openly support dictators when it's strategically convenient. When it isn't anymore, well then it's time to get democratized, baby. Marcos's victory was a disaster for China. The Philippines' new president was a staunch US ally, and it sees China as an existential threat not just to the Philippines, but the greater South Pacific region. For his part, Marcos would probably be a lot less outraged at China if the nation hadn't been illegally building military bases in other people's territorial waters. The US has been criticized for neocolonialism, yet China is just doing things the old-fashioned way and taking territory by force. Under international law, every nation has an exclusive claim to waters a set distance from its shores. This can lead to conflict in places like the South China Sea, with so many different nations so close together. Citing post-World War II maps and claims that its sailing vessels have historically moved through those waters, China's laid claim to literally the entire South China Sea. And a quick look on the map reveals that China is in no way anywhere near its claims. China claims basically all of Vietnamese waters, half of the Philippines, and large chunks of Malaysia, Brunei, and beyond. China's claims include waters as much as 1,000 miles away from its own shores. This would be like the United States claiming basically all of Russia's Arctic coastline from Alaska, or all of the Philippines' west coast and most of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea's north coast from Guam. The 9-dash line has its origin in 1946, when Mao Zedong had drawn a map that suddenly showed the entire South China Sea as belonging to China because, well, why not? Unsurprisingly, affected nations laughed China's claims away, given that these waters were critical for their own economies. They kept on laughing until the 90s, when China's growing naval might suddenly became significantly less funny. China regularly sent Coast Guard vessels with actual military vessels in the distance, to harass the fishing fleets of other nations. It also began to build up artificial islands from which to project power, and today has established multiple bases commonly referred to as unsinkable aircraft carriers in the region. Now, nobody's laughing anymore, and China's bullying has extended to capsizing other nations' ships, and in the case of Vietnam, simply moving their oil drilling wells right into Vietnamese territorial waters. In 2020, China sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat with 8 men on board for fishing near the Paracel Islands, and in 2014 it carried out a similar attack captured on video. China has also used its much larger vessels to intimidate and harass oil exploration vessels from other countries. China has started to shut other nations off of the energy and fish wealth of the South China Sea. The region's also estimated to contain one of the largest untapped oil and gas reserves in the world. So maintaining control of the waters China is contesting is becoming more and more vital. Filipino fishermen who made their living fishing off of reefs, now regularly patrolled by hostile Chinese vessels, began to feel the economic pain. To reinforce its own territorial claims, the Philippines began to station Marines on various reefs or even floating wrecks, with China regularly ramming supply vessels or using water cannons to keep them away from resupplying their troops. The attacks slowed significantly during the Duterte years, but have now resumed with the election of Bongbong Marcos, and Marcos has had enough. Marcos made multiple military bases available for U.S. forces shortly after coming to power. This was a major win for the U.S., as it expanded its ability to station air power in the region, a chief concern for combating China in the Pacific. This only intensified China's efforts to bully Filipino vessels in the South China Sea, with the most recent incident including China erecting a floating barrier to keep Filipino fishermen out of a disputed reef. The barrier was dismantled by Filipino divers, and in response, Marcos announced even closer cooperation with the United States. The Philippines is a strategic linchpin for the U.S. in the Pacific. America's biggest weakness is the distance its forces have to travel to engage in battle. Even in a war that would take place primarily in the air and at sea, the tyranny of distance limits how long and how much the U.S. can fight. It even limits payloads on combat aircraft. However, the Philippines are less than 200 miles away from Taiwan at their nearest points, which would allow the U.S. air power to stage at Filipino airfields and run combat sorties against the Chinese ships and ground forces around or on the island. From the Philippines, U.S. air power could even regularly strike at the Chinese mainland, a critical need if the U.S. is to ensure victory over China in case of a war. Through its own bad behavior, China's ensured that the U.S. and the Philippines are closer than ever, and this has significantly weakened its own military position by doing so. As the old saying goes, China, you done played yourself. China's Xi Jinping has made it clear Taiwan will be reunified with the mainland, even if it means it must happen at gunpoint. Meanwhile, America's President Joe Biden has vowed that America will defend Taiwan from invasion. The die has been cast for a showdown in the Pacific, and in what might be the fastest, most brutal, and most technologically advanced war to date, it's both nations' navies who will be doing the bulk of the fighting. So, who's really better, the Chinese or American Navy? China's naval expansion has been explosive and as miraculous as its economic expansion in the late 20th and early 21st century. Reeling from its humiliation during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s, when the U.S. sailed a carrier strike group through the Taiwan Strait in response to Chinese missiles launched over Taiwan, China was determined to push the U.S. Navy off its shores for good. In 2012, Chinese President Hu Jintao called for China to become a maritime power so it could safeguard its own interests. Just 11 years later, China has overtaken the U.S. as the world's largest navy, and a significant number of its ships are better equipped than America's. In 1996, the Chinese Navy had only 57 destroyers and frigates, and only 3 of those ships carried air defense missiles, leaving them completely vulnerable to anti-ship missile attack. Of its 80 attack submarines, 3/4 of them were Soviet Rome-class, which entered service in 1950. But by 2015, China had already surpassed the U.S. Navy in size, with the DoD placing the Chinese Navy at 355 ships and submarines in 2021. That same year, the U.S. Navy had only 296 ships. When it comes to shipbuilding, China is leaving the U.S. in the dust. Between 2017 and 2019, China put more ships in the sea than India, Japan, Australia, France, and the UK combined. In 2021, Vice Admiral Kai-Achim Schonbach stated that the Chinese Navy was adding the equivalent of the entire French Navy to its inventory every 4 years. That same year, the U.S. Navy commissioned 7 vessels. China, meanwhile, commissioned 28. By 2030, it's estimated that China could have as many as 425 combat vessels. By comparison, the U.S. Navy is predicted to have only 309 combat vessels active. However, this is assuming that the People's Liberation Army Navy continues to have its budget expanded indefinitely. something that is extremely unlikely. After years of increasing defense spending, China is finally applying the brakes, and a number of brewing economic troubles for China could end up taking a significant bite out of the plan's shipbuilding budget. However, the US should not expect budget woes to significantly decrease the size of the Chinese Navy, as the plan is China's top funding priority at the moment as it seeks to hurl the US out of the Pacific. Numbers aren't everything either. While China has many more ships than the US Navy, the American Navy is still greater by both tonnage and battle force missiles, or a count of how many missiles each fleet can bring to the fight. In 2019, the US had more than double the number of battle force missiles versus China, and 4 years later that figure was shrunk, but the US still retains a significant advantage, and by 2030 it's expected America will still have at least 25% of an advantage in battle force missiles. This is largely due to the disparity in the composition of each nation's fleets. China has a significant number of small vessels such as frigates and corvettes, with 43 frigates and 72 corvettes. While these ships can carry deadly anti-ship missiles, they do so in far fewer numbers than larger ships such as destroyers and cruisers. They also lack advanced radars and other equipment that their bigger cousins have, in exchange for the ability to operate quickly along coastal areas, a requirement that China has great need for. However, the US Navy has a greater requirement for projecting large amounts of firepower far from its own shores, meaning a focus on larger destroyers and missile cruisers. The US, for instance, has nearly twice the number of destroyers as China, with 92 versus China's 50. Where it really matters, though, and where the US is set to keep the advantage even to 2030 and beyond, is in aircraft carriers. Currently, the US operates 11 aircraft carriers and 9 smaller amphibious assault carriers versus China's 2 operational aircraft carriers and 3 light carriers. America's carriers can put more aircraft into the sky than most nations' entire air forces, and this matters a great deal as the aircraft remains the dominant naval weapon in service today. America's carriers are also bigger and more capable, with far more mature air platforms such as the F-18 and F-35 versus China. And yet, China's shipbuilding spree means that it has the advantage of fielding more advanced ships than the US, making use of new radars and sensors that US ships must either wait for, refit for, or will never get until they're completely replaced by a brand new ship. There's a big advantage to building a navy from scratch, while the US has to make do with the same ships it's had for as much as 40 years. This could lead to a significant upset in the brawl in the Pacific, but how does each nation's ships stack up against the other? When it comes to aircraft carriers, China is not only dwarfed in size but also in capabilities. Its Type 001 and 002 carriers, the Liaoning and Shandong, are all former Soviet Kuznetsov-class carriers, with the Liaoning originally purchased from Russia so that China could begin training on carrier operations. China does have a modern carrier in development right now, the Type 003, but that ship won't be operational for years yet. Each of these carriers is equipped with 44 total aircraft, including 32 J-15 Flying Sharks, 8 Shanghe transport helicopters, and 4 Harbin anti-submarine warfare helicopters. The ship is also equipped with 3 Sea-Whiz stations and 3 short-range air defense missile cells, each holding 18 missiles. This allows the carrier to put up a last-ditch defense against incoming anti-ship missiles, though its primary protection is its escort fleet and aircraft. But China's current carriers have a few problems. The J-15 is China's first attempt at building a carrier fighter, and this off-brand Sukhoi fighter has a host of problems. Originally reverse-engineered from a Su-33 prototype purchased from Ukraine in 2001, China has yet to address key problems in the fighter's design. Its engines are very underpowered, which limits how much ordnance a J-15 could bring to the fight, a limitation that exists on top of that imposed by the Type 001 and Type 002 ski ramp design, which forces fighters to sacrifice either ordnance or fuel. China has historically always had troubles designing modern jet engines, and these troubles persist to this day. During testing, China lost 4 J-15s to crashes believed to be caused by mechanical troubles in the aircraft's engines. Adding to the J-15's troubles is the fact that it is one of the heaviest carrier fighters in the world, weighing in at a whopping 60,000 pounds. This is in comparison to the US's F-18 Super Hornet, coming in at a svelte 32,000 pounds and enjoying the benefit of much more powerful engines. Without going on a diet or developing far more powerful engines, China's small fleet of J-15s is best left on shore-based airfields rather than going to sea in what will inevitably be a losing war against US carrier fighters. China, however, is not resting on its laurels and is looking to develop a true 5th-generation carrier-based plane, a dicey proposition for a nation that's yet to master a conventional carrier fighter. The US Navy currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with 4 more carriers on order to 2032. America's current carrier fleet is composed of 10 Nimitz-class carriers, with the newest addition being the USS Gerald R. Ford, lead ship to the new Ford-class carriers. Unlike China's carrier fleet, every one of America's carriers are super carriers, with over double the aircraft. Nuclear carriers. America's fleet has the advantage of nuclear propulsion, which allows its ships to stay out at sea indefinitely. It also makes American carriers faster than conventional carriers, with a top speed that's classified but in excess of 30 knots. It's well known that at full power, a big U.S. supercarrier can outrun even its own escorts. This is a significant capability, given that a U.S. carrier's biggest enemy is China's vast inventory of anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from mainland China, greatly increasing the search radius of an incoming ballistic missile on a terminal descent. Like Chinese carriers, America's supercarriers are equipped with short-range air defenses to knock incoming missiles out of the sky, but also boast torpedo countermeasures. Its surface ship torpedo defense system was designed to directly attack incoming torpedoes, specifically those designed to home in on a ship's wake and thus immune to decoys. However, reliability issues have forced the removal of the system from 5 carriers that it was already installed on. While the system worked, its various components were unreliable, and now the Navy's looking to build on lessons learned to field a new active protection anti-torpedo system. Its most potent weapon, though, is its air wing. While acting as a mobile transport, each supercarrier can accommodate up to 130 F-18 Hornets. But in battle configuration, carriers typically carry 64 combat aircraft. Typically, this consists of 34 to 48 F-18s and 4 to 6 EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare. However, increasingly, the Navy is adopting the F-35C, or carrier variant, of America's most numerous stealth fighter. The F-35 is nothing short of a game-changer, and China's naval air forces have nothing to match. However, just because the U.S. can bring more and more modern aircraft to the fight doesn't mean the U.S. has all the advantages. For one, China's AWACS platforms feature more powerful and more modern radars than the U.S.'s, which has lagged behind in acquiring more modern replacements for its aging AWACS air fleet. Once again, China has the advantage of building from scratch. But China also has the advantage in air-to-air missiles. Its J-15s might be hard-pressed to take off with an adequate combat loadout to truly challenge a U.S. naval air fleet, but the few that China can bring to the fight are all equipped with better missiles than anything the U.S. has to offer. The PL-15 has not only a greater range than America's AIM-120, estimates vary but are commonly accepted to be about a dozen miles, it's also faster than Western air-to-air missiles, even Britain's formidable Meteor. This allows Chinese aircraft to fire first against fourth-generation American aircraft from further away, making a fight between conventional U.S. and Chinese aircraft a dicey proposition for American aviators. The U.S. is striking back, though. Outpaced by China during its focus on the War on Terror, the U.S. now has no less than 6 new air-to-air missiles in development. Some of these are focused on replacing U.S. short-range Sidewinder missiles, but the most likely candidate to replace America's long-range striking power is the AIM-260, which features a classified range believed to be in excess of 25% greater than China's PL-15. The AIM-260 is expected to enter procurement within the next year or so, eliminating the only advantage China currently enjoys in the sky over the U.S. American aircraft, however, pose another significant threat to the Chinese Navy, and that comes in the form of a new generation of anti-ship missiles. China leapfrogged the U.S. with the development of the YJ-12 missile, an air-launched cruise missile that can be fitted with a warhead ranging from 450 to 1,100 pounds. The heavier warheads can be launched from China's fleet of bombers as well as its destroyers, while the lighter warhead can be used on China's fighter aircraft. Alone, the missile has a range of approximately 250 miles, and when launched from a fighter, that can mean China could strike as far away as nearly 1,000 miles. Moving at Mach 4 with sea-skimming capabilities, the YJ-12 only gives American defenses approximately 45 seconds to respond to an incoming attack, making the U.S. ships very vulnerable to saturation attacks that overwhelm their air defenses. The U.S. is striking back in 2 ways. First, it's slowly replacing its stockpile of Cold War Harpoon anti-ship missiles. These venerable weapons have a 488-pound warhead and a range of only about 75 nautical miles. Though latest block developments have increased that range to 120 nautical miles, further they travel at subsonic speeds, making the Harpoon a significant downgrade from the YJ-12. The U.S. has responded to the YJ-12, as it so often does, with technological overkill. The Harpoon's replacement is the Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, and is a generational leap ahead of the YJ-12. Its maximum range is classified, but believed to be around 230 nautical miles, with a 1,000-pound warhead. Unlike the YJ-12, the LRASM is subsonic, but that's not a flaw, it's a design feature, because the LRASM is not a normal anti-ship missile, it's a stealth anti-ship missile. Featuring some of the same materials used in U.S. stealth airframes, the LRASM travels at subsonic speeds in order to control its thermal signature and relies on its stealth capabilities to significantly shorten engagement time for enemy air defenses. The missile's advanced AI also allows it to be fired into a midst of enemy ships, with the missile's sensors comparing each potential target with an onboard library to select the right ship to hit. It can even differentiate between military and civilian ships and prioritize high-value targets such as aircraft carriers or amphibious assault ships over picket ships placed ahead of an enemy fleet to draw in hostile fire and defend from missile attacks. Launched in swarms, the LRASM can also deconflict, ensuring that multiple missiles don't strike the same target if unnecessary to achieve a kill. For all its advantages though, the US military still has only a few hundred of these missiles, and will likely need many more to launch saturation attacks that guarantee kills on Chinese ships. If war were to break out today, the US would be doing the bulk of its fighting at a decisive anti-ship disadvantage. The second way the US is striking back against the YJ-12 though is to simply stop them from being launched in the first place. The US military calls it cooperative engagement capability, and it basically boils down to connecting shooters with observers across an entire battle space. First dreamt up in the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in the early 1970s, it was originally called Battle Group Anti-Air Warfare Coordination, but advancements in technology would only make it possible to conduct the first realistic trials in 1990. By 1992, however, CEC became an official acquisitions program. CEC breaks down to simply allowing one observer to guide the weapon fired by another shooter to their target. It also allows U.S. Navy ships and planes to cooperatively engage targets that only one partner might be able to see, bringing the total lethality of a deployed air wing or surface action group to bear on a target normally only able to be engaged by one platform. In a combat situation, the U.S. Navy would utilize its F-35 or stealth drones to penetrate into enemy airspace. EA-18G Growlers would use their electronic attack capabilities to actively degrade enemy sensors, allowing the F-35s to get even closer to well-protected airspace. F-35s could then pass on weapons quality tracking data to loitering E-2D Hawkeye platforms, which would then relay that data to fourth-generation aircraft such as the F-18. This effectively allows non-stealthy aircraft to engage deep inside of denied airspace by using stealth platforms to guide their weapons to target. The Navy is actively working on further programs to enhance situational awareness deep inside of contested airspace. F-35s may be stealthy, but that stealth goes right out the window the moment one turns on its radar to look for targets. This is why the F-35 has excellent passive sensors, but those severely limit the range at which they can independently track and identify enemy targets. Disposable drones and other tools are in development to solve this problem, and it's not just aircraft that can be brought into the kill chain, but ground or sea-based platforms as well. This would effectively deny China the ability to fly anti-ship aircraft within launch range of U.S. ships, negating the air-launched anti-ship missile threat. Up next, we have the two sides opposing destroyer fleets. China's latest destroyer, the Type 055, is a significant improvement over America's own ships by virtue of being a more modern design. However, the Type 55 is characterized as a cruiser by the U.S. Navy, given its larger size and capability to carry flag officers on board. Thus, it's better compared to the U.S.'s Ticonderoga-class cruisers than its Arleigh Burke destroyers. The Type 55 displaces 11,000 tons versus a Ticonderoga's 9,600 tons, giving it a significant mass advantage, and mass matters when anti-ship missiles are taken into consideration. However, all that extra mass also comes in the form of greater capabilities. The Type 55 has a max speed of 30 knots, making it slightly slower than a Ticonderoga at 32.5 knots. Not surprising given the significant mass difference between the two hulls. The Chinese cruiser also has a smaller range than its U.S. equivalent, with a range of about 5,000 nautical miles versus a Ticonderoga's 6,000 nautical miles. This is of little concern though, since China currently faces a war in its immediate neighborhood, while the U.S. must always fight the tyranny of distance and send ships far from its friendly shores. The U.S. has traditionally had an advantage in radar technology, but China's new Type 346B radars offer comparable capabilities to U.S. radars. It's hard to make an accurate assessment of which ships will have better radar, though, given significant amounts of Chinese disinformation about its own radar capabilities. Often, the Chinese, as the Russians, will claim to have radars capable of spotting American stealth aircraft, and that's not a surprise. American stealth fighters are not optimized to defeat low-frequency radars used to detect and track planes at long range, but rather high-frequency radars used to provide accurate weapon lock. Only large platforms like the B-2 and B-21 Raider are designed to defeat both types of radar. China's Type 55 comes up short against America's Ticonderoga in missile count, with 112 missiles versus 122. However, the Type 55 packs the YJ-12 anti-ship missile, while the Ticonderoga still carries the Harpoon anti-ship missile, swinging the advantage back in China's favor. With the advantage of building from scratch, the Type 55 also enjoys significant signature reduction features, making it harder to detect via radar or infrared versus a Ticonderoga. While the Type 55 is not a true stealth ship such as the US's Zumwalt destroyer, every advantage matters in combat. As it stands, the Type 55 can engage a Ticonderoga from further away with deadlier missiles. Zumwalts, by the way, aren't even worth mentioning in this review, as it's unlikely they'd even see combat. With only 3 ships in the class, the current fleet is more of a test bed than a combat-capable force, and it, along with the littoral combat ship, is a lesson in poor procurement practices for the US military. The US does maintain the numbers advantage, though, with 17 Ticonderogas versus China's 9 Type 55s. However, China continues to build Type 55s, while America's shipyards struggle to keep up with Navy orders and the US's replacement for the Ticonderoga, the DDG-X program. In the meantime, aging Ticonderogas are being replaced by Flight 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, and it's these destroyers who will be making up the bulk of the US surface combat power against China's Navy. In this matchup, we have the Arleigh Burke versus China's Type 52D. Currently, America is in the midst of a Flight 3 modernization program for its Arleigh Burkes, featuring improved radar amongst other capabilities. The first of the US's Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes was completed in 2021, and work continues at a steady pace to modernize the rest of the fleet even as the US looks to its DDG-X program to replace the entire class. Arleigh Burkes significantly outgunned their Type 52D opponents, weighing in at 9,500 tons in their Flight 3 configuration versus 7,500 tons. They also outmuscled the Type 52D with 96 total missile cells and 2 torpedo tubes versus the Type 52D's 64 missile cells. However, when accounting for short-range air defense missiles, the Type 52D packs an additional 24 missiles in the HQ-10 short-range air defense variety, closing the gap with an Arleigh Burke. For its part, the Arleigh Burke can quad-pack its RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, which provides defense at medium ranges from incoming missiles and aircraft. Earlier Arleigh Burke models carry no helicopter, but Flights 2 and 3 models now carry 2 helicopters, which can be used for hunting down enemy submarines or conducting general reconnaissance, while the stretch variant of the Type 52D carrier carries 1 Harbin Z-20 helicopter. Pound for pound, the Arleigh Burke outmuscles the Type 52D opponent, as it's part of the reason the US still has significantly more firepower than the Chinese Navy despite having fewer ships. Now, we move under the waves, with the US fielding 68 submarines versus China's 78. However, once more, numbers are only part of the comparison, because there is little doubt that the US has the decisive advantage in undersea warfare. Comparing the two navies' submarines can be difficult, given the extreme secrecy concerning some of the most powerful weapons to cruise the oceans. China has historically lagged far behind all the major powers in submarine warfare, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that the nation began to build what could be considered modern submarines. Originally, it purchased 12 Russian submarines to add to its fleet, and undoubtedly to reverse engineer, while adding 30 conventional submarines of the Sun and Yuan class, with a further 25 Yuan-class boats to enter service by 2025. While all of America's submarines are nuclear-powered, only 12 of China's are: 2 Shang-1, 4 Shang-2, and 6 Jin-class subs, with the Jin-class being China's first sea-based nuclear deterrent and armed with nuclear ballistic missiles. Nuclear power doesn't necessarily mean that the US fleet is better than China's, as nuke boats are notoriously noisy and difficult to silence, something that the US has spent untold billions and decades of research into solving. Given that the US Navy must fight far from home, conventional powered submarines are simply not an option, while China enjoys the benefit of fighting close to friendly ports. Thus, it has less of a need for long-endurance nuclear subs. However, as China looks past throwing the US out of the Pacific and looks to becoming a global power, it is increasingly interested in further developing its nuclear submarines. US submarines are more than capable of engaging surface ships, but America's subfleet is heavily focused on finding and eliminating rival submarines. China, meanwhile, has historically looked to its submarines to be part of a surface strike force, and only recently has it looked to change its submarine doctrine to be more in line with America's. This means that while their stealth is steadily improving, American Los Angeles and now Virginia-class submarines remain significantly ahead of their Chinese counterparts. However, China is well aware of this, and while it tries to close the technological gap under the waves, it seems more likely that China will focus on numbers rather than quality. In what's been called an undersea flood, China may simply opt to flood regional waters with a large number of submarines, seriously complicating the U.S. submarine fleet's efforts to destroy the Chinese surface fleet. The greatest threat to the U.S. subfleet, though, is that in order to simply maintain the current fleet while retiring aging vessels, America must build 2 new submarines every year. Yet the U.S. is far behind this quota and is struggling to complete 1 new submarine a year. Estimates by the U.S. Navy state it'll take at least until 2028 for U.S. shipbuilders to produce 2 Virginia-class boats a year, while China is actively expanding its own submarine production capabilities. Like in so many areas, China is simply outproducing the US, and even if some of its components are less advanced than the US's, numbers matter a great deal, especially when the US must face China on unequal terms, because while China's concerns are regional, the US Navy has global security commitments that it simply can't abandon even in case of a full-scale war against China. And this is America's greatest weakness as its Navy faces off against China's. Starting during the Obama presidency, the U.S. Pacific Fleet became the largest of its numerous fleets, but because of global security requirements, in any war the U.S. can still only bring to bear a portion of its navy against China, while China can throw the entire plan against the Pacific Fleet. To counter this numbers disparity, the U.S. Navy is looking to seriously augment its fleet with unmanned drone ships and submarines, but this program has run into various difficulties, including a lack of vision on what exactly these unmanned vessels should be. Should the U.S. be building unmanned arsenal ships whose sole duty is to follow fleets around and fire vast numbers of missiles, or should it acquire stealthy surface ships which can zip deeply into enemy waters and launch attacks against Chinese ships? A lack of direction is the U.S. Navy's biggest problem. While China's procurement efforts are laser-focused, the U.S. Navy has for 2 decades been adrift in its aims and goals. This has led to numerous disastrous acquisitions which have burned up significant capital and time, both things the U.S. Navy could not afford to lose. The littoral combat ship is one example, a disaster of a ship that is combat insurvivable and haunted by frequent breakdowns. And yet, the U.S. continues to acquire them at a cost of $650 million apiece because Congress refuses to cancel the program, despite the U.S. Navy retiring LCS hulls within years of acquisition. Navy officials have practically begged Congress to stop buying the ship, yet precious shipyard space and acquisition funds continue to be wasted because the LCS program provides jobs in key congressional districts. The Zumwalt-class destroyer is another famous disaster. Pricing in at $4.4 billion, it was the costliest destroyer ever built by the U.S. Navy, and it is all but unusable in combat. When initially designed, the Zumwalt promised to be a cutting-edge next-generation ship that featured a very stealthy design with an advanced gun system which could fire conventional munitions with high precision hundreds of miles. Instead, as the Zumwalt's fancy new gun never truly materialized, the Navy was forced to cancel the entire Zumwalt program, skyrocketing the cost of its main gun's ammunition to $1 million a shot, promptly leading to its cancellation as well. All in all, the Zumwalt program is estimated to have cost the U.S. Navy $22 billion, and today the 3 surviving ships have no real combat role. With time and tens of billions of dollars wasted, the Navy has fallen behind its Chinese rival, but it does still retain key advantages which could prove decisive. First of all, the U.S. Navy is a combat-tested force. While it has seen no major surface action since 1944, it's involved in numerous combat engagements since then. The Chinese Navy's entire experience to date, meanwhile, consists of largely bullying other nations' fishing vessels off their own territorial waters. The U.S. also participates in routine large-scale exercises such as RIMPAC, which includes the ships of numerous other allied and partner nations. A culture of realistic training exercises that integrates combined arms operations gives the U.S. a training edge that China will struggle to match, given that its own training has historically been severely limited and overwhelmingly choreographed. It's only in recent years that China's begun to undergo realistic training, and only in the late 2010s did China integrate its military services under a joint command structure. America's second advantage is the one weapon it has that China cannot hope to match, and it's not a missile or a new airplane, rather it's U.S. allies. There is some debate as to which Pacific allies would join the U.S. in a fight against China, but the U.S. has various treaties and partnerships with numerous Pacific countries. Those countries, in turn, have their own partnerships or alliances with major powers, such as the UK. Given that U.S. ships and aircraft are based on nations such as Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea, China faces the prospect of either being attacked by American assets from all fronts or attacking these facilities directly in order to deny their use to America. This will undoubtedly, however, pull those host nations into the conflict, magnifying China's problems. Japan and Australia are almost certain to immediately join the fight against China, given that China represents a significant threat to both nations' own maritime security. Japan is an import nation, which relies on sea trade to import various amounts of materials and food that it needs to operate its economy and keep its people fed. Yet most of Japan's trade routes run right past Taiwan, giving China the ability to sever Japan's trade if it were to take the island back by force. This is unacceptable to Japan, and even now Japan has rewritten its pacifist constitution to allow it to acquire more offensive weapons with which to threaten Chinese ships, ports, and even inland air bases. America's global network of allies gives the U.S. the ultimate high ground, even if it is currently outmatched in terms of number and even individual weapon systems. But the U.S. has one final trump card to play against the Chinese Navy, a naval blockade that China is helpless to stop. From the Gulf of Oman or the Malacca Straits, U.S. ships can impose a naval blockade of China's oil imports. With 60% of its global trade coming in via sea and the overwhelming majority of its oil supply, this puts China in the unenviable position of having its trade jugular severed by the U.S. Navy in two different geographical choke points. This is the reason that China is currently working toward acquiring numerous aircraft carriers, yet for now the nation remains unable to challenge a U.S. naval blockade. Even in the foreseeable future, if China were to match the U.S. in number of supercarriers, America still has the advantage of numerous friends and allies, which all ring these strategic choke points and could threaten any Chinese fleet with land-based or airborne anti-ship missile systems. A war between the U.S. and Chinese navies would be bloody and costly, but one side would emerge the clear victor, and in any scenario, time favors a U.S. victory. A Chinese submarine lurks below the waters of the Indian Ocean. Suddenly, an explosion rocks the vessel. An anti-submarine torpedo has struck the stern. Water begins rushing in as compartments are sealed. The Chinese crew blows the ballasts. They need to surface now, or the submarine will sink to the ocean floor, crushing all who are inside. The torpedo was launched from the newly deployed Indian anti-submarine warfare shallow watercraft corvette. It's been tracking the Chinese intruder for several hours. The sub sends an emergency message for help back to China as it breaks the surface. The People's Navy deploys to the region. As it passes through the Malacca Strait, Indian destroyers, frigates, and aircraft carriers lie in wait at several choke points. The vessels unload their cannons, missiles, and torpedoes. The trapped Chinese ships are decimated. This hypothetical scenario may happen in the future, and it might be closer than you think. But thanks to one specific set of islands, India might have the advantage if China ever tries to expand its influence further into the Indian Ocean. The chain known as the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are in one of the most strategically significant locations in the world. This bit of land may hold the key to balancing the powers rising in South and East Asia. For decades, India has been slowly militarizing the island chain. But progress has been slow. That all might change in the coming years as China tries to expand its influence further south and west. India is feeling the pressure both economically and to their national security. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are their best chance of securing the waters along India's coastline while monitoring the shipping routes that much of the traffic in the region uses. This includes Chinese vessels, which is why these Indian islands have Beijing very worried. It probably goes without saying that India and China don't have the best relationship. There are constant clashes between the troops along their borders in the Himalayas, as there's never been an agreement over exactly where India ends and Chinese-controlled Tibet begins. Conflict between the two nations is only exacerbated by both governments trying to boost their economies while becoming more influential on a global scale. It's these two nations who are fighting for supremacy in East and Southeast Asia as they grow in strength. However, in terms of global economic power, the waterways between China and India are key. Both countries have formidable armies and navies, but for China, it's imperative that they have access to the Indian Ocean for several reasons. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands could really put a damper on China's plans for the future. The key here is to remember that whoever controls the Malacca Strait controls the main waterway that ships use to move goods and supplies between the Indian Ocean and East Asia. This includes goods from Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. Right now, India is in a position to be the dominant player in controlling the area, thanks to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Let's look at the history, importance, and strategic significance of the islands. As we dive deeper into this region of the world, it'll become glaringly clear why China is so terrified that India is increasing the militarization of the Andaman and Nicobar chain. It's very possible that what India does in the coming year could directly impact China's ability to spread its influence in the region. In a worst-case scenario, these islands might be ground zero for an all-out conflict between India and China. The island chain itself is 22 nautical miles from Myanmar and only 90 miles from Indonesia. This allows India's navy and aircraft to have quick and easy access to not only the Bay of Bengal, but the 6-degree and 10-degree channels, through which around 60,000 vessels pass each year. The importance of this region cannot be overstated, as Chinese trading ships require access to these waters. Otherwise, a large part of their trade network would come screeching to a halt. To put it into perspective, China receives around 3/4 of all of its oil from trade routes running through the Indian Ocean. If they were to lose access to these shipping lanes, it would be devastating for their economy and infrastructure. If we go back in time, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands have always been a strategically important location. Chinese Buddhist monks of the 7th century, Arab travelers hundreds of years ago, and even Marco Polo visited the islands. This is because they serve as a vital stopping point while traveling through the waters connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans. When the British colonized India, they turned the Andaman Islands into a penal colony. The use by the British pushed indigenous communities out and eventually led to the establishment of Port Blair, which now contains a naval base and airfield. When India gained its independence in 1947, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were officially incorporated into their borders. Over the years, the islands have developed into a popular tourist destination for people in the region. However, it's not the growing tourism industry that China's worried about. It's the growing military presence that concerns them. Over the last couple of decades, China's been increasingly trying to expand its influence in the Indian Ocean. They've deployed expeditionary naval forces, conducted arms sales, and made strategic connections with other nations throughout the region. This obviously worried India, which then forced the government to seek out ways to bring Chinese expansion to a stop or at least slow it down. It quickly became apparent that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands could be the answer to India's problems. Its location allows for the monitoring of the different waterways in the region along with large areas of the mainland. China's used the guise of anti-piracy operations to send submarines and naval vessels into the waters off the coast of India. They've also established bases in places like Gwadar and Djibouti to increase their military presence in the Indian Ocean, but China's been expanding its naval operations closer to India's borders as well. For example, Chinese naval and survey vessels have been sighted in the Andaman Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and even in India's exclusive economic zone. It's clear that China is becoming more aggressive in its actions in the South China Sea, along with parts of South Asia. They constructed artificial islands where they deployed military personnel and assets, and this has been a huge cause of concern for nations like Taiwan. But there's also a real concern that the militarization of the South China Sea could cause irreparable harm to the freedom of navigation rules in the Indo-Pacific region. This open trade agreement is vital to maintaining peace and political stability in the area. India's been keeping a close eye on China's actions in the South China Sea and is planning for a future where China starts expanding into the Andaman Sea or the Bay of Bengal. China's already engaged in illegal and unregulated fishing practices in the areas, which is a resource vital to India and other countries in the region that border the ocean. For years, China's been pushing its luck to see how much it can get away with. India has become fed up and is starting to take more drastic actions by using the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to strengthen their position and keep China in check. The increase of military assets being deployed to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands is taking their time. More naval ships and personnel are deployed on the islands every year in preparation for a more aggressive stance in the waters of the region. At Point Blair, the small military base is being reimagined as an intelligence hub where aircraft, ships, and communication airways can set up to gather more intel about China's military movements. This strategic listening post will provide India with the upper hand in the region, especially if they need to take naval action, which is obviously a cause of concern for China. As the Andaman and Nicobar Islands become more of a military asset to India, China's ability to push the boundaries of where their ships and aircraft can go without repercussions diminishes. In the future, the intelligence gathered by radar and listening posts on the islands could inform not just the Indian military, but other nations who might also have interests to protect in the region, such as Australia, Japan, and even the US. But with the ability to gather more intelligence, India also needs to be able to control what's happening in the area. One key aspect of this is promoting the island chain as an economic hub and port for trade ships. This is why India has plans to build a major port at Great Nicobar Island that's estimated to cost $1.5 billion. And for China, any country that poses a threat to its economic might is a country that they will look to punish. If India is successful in creating a major transshipment port on the Andaman and Nicobar Island chain, Chinese ships will likely need to utilize it to maintain certain trade agreements. Since India is already battling an economic war to secure jobs, resources, and manufacturing contracts with China, the leadership of the People's Republic is probably less than thrilled that they might have to use Indian-controlled ports in the future. If India can entice the international community to use their ports in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it could allow them to gain a substantial piece of the enormous amount of trade that's done with China. This will also allow India and the countries they're close to control supply chains, which might allow sanctions on China to be more easily enforced. The repercussions of this reality could be disastrous for the Chinese economy. China is likely extremely worried about how India's ports in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands will affect their ability to procure resources from Africa and Europe. But there's also another issue for China if the islands become a mainstream stop for vessels passing through the region. Southeast Asian nations such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore rely heavily on Chinese goods. However, if there's easier access to global markets, they might start trading with other parts of the world. No matter how China looks at it, if the Andaman and Nicobar Islands become economic and shipment hubs, their own trade network could be put into jeopardy. And if all of this wasn't enough, now the quadrilateral security dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States has resulted in military exercises being conducted near the islands. These exercises are identifying shortcomings in India's ability to successfully protect its waterways and allowing for future plans to defend and control all major channels running through the region to be more effective. However, a big problem is becoming increasingly clear to India as it tries to strengthen its position, and China is almost certainly aware of it. When comparing India's naval capability with China, there's a huge gap. China has the largest navy in the world, and we all know from the war in Ukraine, having more military vessels does not necessarily mean a nation will be able to win a war. However, numbers are definitely on China's side at the moment. According to estimates, China has around 730 naval vessels, while India has about 295. Both countries have 2 aircraft carriers, but India is vastly outnumbered in every other type of naval vessel. China has 50 destroyers, 43 frigates, 72 corvettes, and 78 submarines. India, on the other hand, has 11 destroyers, 12 frigates, 19 corvettes, and 18 submarines. You can see the massive disparity between the two forces, but, and this is a big but, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands could help negate the differences in numbers due to its strategic location. Even if a large Chinese fleet was able to traverse the Malacca Strait, India would still have several choke points around the islands that could be used to counteract the numbers of China's navy. If the Chinese navy was drawn too close to the islands, India could launch missiles, rockets, and artillery from the shoreline to cause massive damage. On top of this, if China becomes too aggressive, the joint missions being conducted as a result of the quadrilateral security dialogue means that India will likely receive some help from one or all of the nations that they conduct exercises with. In recent years, China's been using one of their favorite tactics to try to gain the upper hand in the waters around India. Misdirection and straight-up lies are employed to draw attention away from what they're really doing. When India started deploying more ships and military personnel to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, China deployed submarines to the area. This was done to gather information, but when China was caught in Indian waters, they claimed ignorance and said that the misplaced submarine had nothing to do with India's deployment of military assets to Andaman and Nicobar. The Chinese Defense Ministry also said that the People's Liberation Army often cooperates with other militaries in the region, including India, which only added positive factors for regional peace and stability. What China was really doing was responding to India's naval deployment in the Andaman Sea. And when they got caught, Chinese leadership made up some BS to try and distract from the fact that they were in India's territory. This has happened time and time again, such as in the waters around Taiwan, the Himalayan border with India, and anywhere else China has a military presence. These operations are called gray zone tactics, in which China uses disruptive measures and aggression that doesn't result in war, but is not appropriate during peacetime either. Naval incursions into Indian territory, the setting up of naval bases in the Indian Ocean, and conflicts along the Himalayan border are all gray zone initiatives that China's using to weaken or threaten India. To counteract China's constant encroachments and desire to expand its influence into the Indian Ocean, a new set of airstrips is being built into the northern and southern islands of Andaman and Nicobar. Indian defense officials say that these airfields will serve 2 purposes. The first is to extend their ability to conduct long-range aerial surveillance. In this aspect, India's plan is to gather as much intel as possible to keep China in check and allow for a fast deployment if things begin to escalate. One example of this is the procurement and increased use of the Boeing P-8I, which has been flown out of Port Blair to conduct anti-submarine surveillance in the surrounding waters. This not only acts as a deterrent, but if it comes down to it, the P-8I could destroy an enemy vessel if needed. This transitions us into the second reason why runways are being built and extended on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. These new extended airfields are being built for national defense as well. Like the naval presence around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, having aircraft will greatly strengthen India's strategic capabilities in the surrounding area. India currently has hundreds of Soviet-era fighters that can still be deadly if used properly. These aircraft include the Sukhoi Su-30 and the MiG-21s. However, it's the much more modern HAL Tejas designed and constructed by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited that could pose a real threat to Chinese forces operating in the region. Having the ability to mount a naval and aerial defense will be vital to the future if India needs to protect the entrance to the Andaman Sea, Bay of Bengal, or waters of the Indian Ocean. Most of the naval vessels currently stationed at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are patrol boats and frontline warships. India is not trying to create a conflict, but it knows that the nation needs to be ready if China does become more aggressive. The more intel they have on what's going on in the waters they control, the better their forces will be able to react to hostilities. And although there are no current plans to build submarine bases on the islands, this might change in the future. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has implemented aggressive plans to update and improve India's infrastructure while earmarking around $750 million to also improve the capabilities of the Andaman and Nicobar Command, the only tri-service theater command in the Indian Armed Forces. What all this means is that India is taking the Chinese threat very seriously. They are actively dedicating money and resources to plans to disrupt Chinese expansion into the Indian Ocean. The stronger Indian forces become on and around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the more difficult it'll be for China to gain control of the waters of South Asia. China wants to become the sole dominant power in the region, and right now India is one of the main obstacles standing in their way. But things aren't going perfectly for India either. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands may be one of the most important island chains in the region, but maintaining infrastructure there can be incredibly difficult for a variety of reasons. One challenge the Indian government has faced has come from environmentalists who want to protect the islands from development. For several years, the military wanted to construct a radar station on Narcondam Island. It's here that the endangered species of bird called the Narcondam Island hornbill lives. For years, the environmentalists successfully pleaded their case and ensured the hornbill's habitat was protected. However, when Prime Minister Modi was elected, he dismissed the concerns and ordered the radar station built anyway. A similar scenario unfolded on the Coco Islands, where even though environmentalists advocated for the protection of the island's habitat, new radar stations were built anyway to allow India to keep an eye on Chinese military bases in Myanmar. Of the 572 islands in the Andaman and Nicobar chain, only 37 are inhabited. This has led to many of the uninhabited islands being used for narcotics smuggling and unsanctioned stopping points for foreign boats. The hundreds of uninhabited islands could pose a threat to the military assets that India set up in the region and the nation's security. This has become such a major concern for military strategists that they've suggested the government encourage people to relocate to the uninhabited islands to help track vessels and deter illegal activity. And even though the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are extremely important, the Indian government has dragged its feet in terms of infrastructure development. It's reported that an undersea cable link between the mainland and the islands has remained unfinished for years, and that internet connectivity, even at the naval base at Port Blair, is spotty at best. The islands also experience intense weather annually, with cyclones sweeping across the region. These storms have caused damage to roads, bridges, and airfields, many of which are never repaired. Heavy rains for 6 months out of the year, stall construction projects, and the distance between the islands and the mainland means it's expensive to ship the materials needed to build and repair infrastructure. And the military is certainly not immune to these problems. Even though India is rapidly trying to ramp up the number of ships, aircraft, and soldiers on the islands, there are a lot of barriers standing in the way. China's most likely been keeping a close eye on the situation in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and knowing just how vital the location is, the struggle to militarize the islands has given China hope. It's very likely that China does not want to go to war with India. No matter who won, an all-out war between the two nations would be catastrophic. Therefore, China is happy to continue using gray zone tactics and its economic and naval power to extend its influence in the region. Even though there's still a long way to go for India to properly fortify their position in the region, eventually the Andaman and Nicobar Islands will play a significant role in controlling the shipping lanes and waterways between the South China Sea and the Andaman Sea. This is a terrifying thought for China, as they do not want anything restricting the movements of their trade and military vessels. There is little doubt that China will continue to extend its power and influence throughout East and Southeast Asia. India's plans for the Andaman and Nicobar Islands may be the only thing standing in their way. As historic tensions rise between the nations of China and Taiwan, it was the UK's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly who repopularized an interesting angle on the debate. What if the biggest loser in a large-scale occupation of Taiwan by Chinese forces was, in fact, China itself? Geopolitics has never been more complex than it is now, especially in this case considering that China is a nuclear state and Taiwan is a key partner of the United States, which could counter China's numerically superior military with its own world-class military technology, training, and spending. One thing that is absolutely certain is that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would quickly spill out of East Asia in scope and likely trigger a cataclysmic war between several nuclear-armed global superpowers. But how did we get here? What makes the war between China, Taiwan, and all their respective allies such a looming possibility? And most importantly for this video, what makes figures like James Cleverly so certain that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will lead to a complete Chinese collapse? First, some important context. What is the history between Taiwan and China, and why does it make some kind of military conflict feel almost inevitable? As with any sticky geopolitical situation, we need to untangle the mess before we can understand it. The first thing you need to understand is that Taiwan is an island nation with a population of around 24 million people off the coast of a much larger China, and it's been an independent nation since 1949. Taiwan is officially known as the Republic of China, or ROC, and mainland China dubs itself the People's Republic of China, or PRC. How you feel about this probably depends on which side of the Taiwan Strait you ally with. Taiwan has a democratically elected government, but the PRC sees it as a kind of rogue state they hope to reunify with the mainland, using force if necessary. This approach to foreign policy is known as the One China principle, and comparisons have been drawn to Russia's takeover of Crimea and the attempted annexation of Ukraine. A lot of the differing interpretations between the two countries originated from a consensus formed in 1992 by negotiators from the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party of the PRC, and the Kuomintang, which at the time was the ruling party of Taiwan. Both nominally agreed to the idea of a One China principle, with the issue being that each country believed themselves to be the One China in their own interpretation of the consensus. But even the name of the consensus is misleading, as it would imply some kind of, actual consensus across all parties involved. The Kuomintang has always generally been sympathetic to the interests of Beijing, with the Kuomintang draft of the Taiwanese constitution not emphasizing the sovereignty of the ROC from the PRC. This line of thought is staunchly opposed by the other primary party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, which currently rules the country with President Tsai Ing-wen as the leader. There was a kind of uneasy peace between the two countries until matters escalated when Tsai Ing-wen was elected as president in 2016. During one of her first speeches as president, she explicitly rejected the 1992 consensus and called for a revaluation of Taiwan's relationship with the mainland. In response, China cut diplomatic ties and escalated its military saber-rattling by flying fighter jets closer and closer to the island and escalating the aggression of its anti-Taiwanese sovereignty rhetoric. President of the PRC, Xi Jinping, has stressed the ideal situation for both nations is a one-country, two-systems policy which would reintegrate Taiwan into the PRC while also allowing it some level of sovereignty, similar to the relationship between China and Hong Kong. But critics of Xi have understandably pointed out the PRC's recent crackdown on the freedoms of citizens in Hong Kong as a reason to believe Beijing's promises of Taiwanese sovereignty aren't necessarily worth the paper they're printed on. Global superpowers have been choosing both sides. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have shown an uncharacteristic closeness to Taiwan, with Joe Biden being the first president of the United States to invite Taiwanese representatives to his presidential inauguration, a powerful symbolic gesture that drew the ire of the PRC. The United States also had continued selling weapons to Taiwan and participating in joint military training exercises. Bipartisan measures have passed U.S. Congress to increase support for U.S.-Taiwan relations, and the U.S. government has lately been encouraging Taiwan to increase its defense spending. But Taiwan isn't alone in needing to increase its defense because you're also at risk of being attacked. That's right, there's a big, glaring hole in your own defense, and it comes from your data. And that's why we're so thankful for the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. Who's selling it, you ask? Data brokers. Those shadowy organizations compile information about you and your family, everything from your birthday, your phone number, court records, even your home address. All of this info and much more is often available to whoever is willing to pay, which opens you and your loved ones to the risk of being doxxed, harassed, or even attacked. There's a real danger to having that information out there on the web in the hands of data brokers, which is why I decided to use Delete Me. So how does it work? Once you sign up, Delete Me experts will begin finding and removing all of your personal information that's out there on the web. After 7 days, you'll receive a detailed Delete Me report outlining all the different places your information has been found. But it doesn't stop there. Delete Me continues to keep you safe by scanning and deleting all your data all year, removing your personal information again from any place it's appeared every 3 months. When I saw my own report, I couldn't believe how many different sites my data was up on for anyone to come and purchase. And what was most surprising was how much of it there was. Multiple addresses, including my current one, phone numbers, and email addresses, you name it, it was out there. So don't wait any longer. Try out Delete Me for yourself and see just how much of your own data is in the hands of data brokers. Just go to joindeleteme.com/GEO and make sure to use my special code GEO for 20% off. You and your data will thank me once you do. Now back to China and Taiwan. Another important symbolic gesture in this regard is the fact that the US regularly sends ships through the Taiwan Strait as a form of posturing, demonstrating their presence in the area in a way that sends a strong message to the PRC. Things escalated even further with the involvement of 2 different high-ranking US politicians engaging in unprecedented acts of diplomacy with Taiwan. Former House Speakers Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy both engaged in diplomatic pleasantries with President Tsai. It probably won't be surprising to hear that the PRC views all of this as escalation and has responded accordingly with sanctions, rhetoric, and displays of military might. According to a 2021 report from the U.S. Department of Defense, the PRC is, quote, likely preparing for a contingency to unify Taiwan with the PRC by force while simultaneously deterring, delaying, or denying any third-party intervention, such as the United States. Needless to say, this is an incredibly concerning prospect for all involved. Debates have raged about when this military action is likely to take place, with predictions over the previous few years falling flat. In 2021, a key U.S. military leader in the Indo-Pacific projected a Chinese invasion of Taiwan by 2031. Other predictions have stressed 2049 as a potential date, in accordance with President Xi Jinping's rhetoric around the Chinese dream, the idea that by 2049, the centenary of the founding of the PRC, China will return to its historic greatness and become a major player on the world stage. Xi has directly said multiple times that the Chinese dream would be impossible without the reunification of China and Taiwan under the One China principle. And as we've alluded to before, China is no slouch militarily. Not only does the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, boast the largest number of military personnel on the planet, but it's also undergone an extensive military modernization plan over the prior decade. In 2019, a military white paper released by the PLA confidently stated that they would be able to, quote, resolutely defeat anyone attempting to separate Taiwan from China. Not exactly mincing words, though it is extremely important to take reports on a country's own army with at least a little pinch of salt, as propaganda is a key tool in everyone's foreign policy. Certain precursors to war have already begun, eerily shadowing the situation between Russia and Ukraine. There's been evidence of Beijing interfering in Taiwanese elections through coordinated disinformation campaigns and attempts to influence Taiwan's media. Taiwan's also accused Beijing of mounting thousands of cyber attacks against the country since 2010, restricting tourism to Taiwan and sailing warships and aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait in order to threaten and intimidate the island nation. Throughout all of this, Taiwan has always held one special bargaining chip that gives it economic sway amongst the rest of the world, and thus a good reason for countries like the United States to ensure stability remains in the region: semiconductor chips. Taiwan is actually the world's leading manufacturer of these chips, which are essential to the production of everything from washing machines to military weapon systems. Corporations the world over need semiconductor chips like the ones produced in Taiwan in order to function, and a protracted Chinese invasion would upset the supply chain in an unprecedented fashion. Which brings us nicely to the real meat of this geopolitical conversation. On the dreadful day that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan does occur, if that day ever comes, what will be the impact? And why do people like the UK's Foreign Secretary believe this could be just as catastrophic for the PRC as anyone else involved in the conflict? James Cleverly has stated that any war between China and Taiwan will compromise the Taiwan Strait, one of the world's most important trade routes. which would not only negatively impact global trade, but completely collapse the Chinese economy by gridlocking their ability to conduct their own trade. Given that China's previously booming economy seems to have cooled down over the past few years, it puts them in a precarious position that could make engaging in an invasion of Taiwan potentially even more risky. Cleverly said, about half the world's container ships pass through these vital waters every year, laden with goods bound for Europe and the far corners of the world. Taiwan is a thriving democracy and a crucial link in global supply chains, particularly for advanced semiconductors. A war across the strait would not only be a human tragedy, it would destroy world trade worth $2.6 trillion, according to Nikkei Asia. No country could shield itself from the repercussions. Distance would offer no protection from this catastrophic blow to the global economy. That being said, many economists also believe that the perception of China's economy as a fragile house of cards is simply wishful thinking. According to Michael Pettis, professor of finance at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University in Beijing, many analysts have concluded that China is on the verge of a crisis, but they do not understand China's heavily controlled financial system, in which regulators can restructure liabilities almost at will. China is very unlikely to suffer from a financial crisis or sudden collapse. Much more likely is many years of slowing growth as it grinds away at debt and slowly rebalances demand towards more consumption and less non-productive investment. However, Pettis' statement was made in a peacetime context. An invasion of Taiwan could be the spark that sets this tinderbox ablaze. A study from Charlie Vest, Agatha Kratz, and Riva Goujon, entitled "The Global Economic Disruptions from a Taiwan Conflict," also offers some interesting insights on the devastating impacts of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. One particularly pertinent portion of the study states, every year banks provide $6.5 to $8 trillion in finance to help importers and exporters facilitate trade while goods are in transit. This short-term finance underpins as much as one-third of trade flows. In the event of a conflict between China and Taiwan, risk-averse global investors would pull back from lending activities, reducing the availability of trade finance and thus impairing international trade. This would mean that the entire global market would become paralyzed as imports and exports from countries across the world fail to make it to their destinations. With imports and exports at a standstill, entire industries and perhaps economies across the world would collapse, leading to a global financial downturn that would envy the Wall Street crash of 1929. Keen military minds may have noticed the phrase, "even assuming no sanctions." To assume a lack of sanctions is extremely generous, as a Taiwan invasion would inevitably activate a bevy of devastating sanctions from the international community. Let's take the consequences that the Ukraine invasion had on Russia as an example of the kind of severe financial sanctions that China might face if it invaded Taiwan. Russia experienced the assets of its central banks being frozen across Western Europe and the United States. Russian banks were effectively pushed out of the global banking community, and many countries such as the UK banned Russian firms from receiving loans. Russian citizens were even subject to depositing limits at banks across the EU. According to the UK government, Western countries cut off around $350 billion of Russia's $604 billion foreign currency reserve. Russian businesses were hit, limiting their ability to operate abroad, and several Russian oligarchs saw their considerable assets frozen in foreign banks. In the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's not unreasonable to expect that these same financial consequences would hit China while Taiwan's allies were mustering their military response. While China's exports have given them a lot of international sway, they also lack Russia's oil wealth to fall back on, meaning that sanctions like these may hit them even harder. Another interesting wrinkle to all this data is the result of a war game simulation conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an independent Washington think tank, earlier in 2023. The intention was simple. If a Chinese invasion of Taiwan broke out in 2026, who would win the conflict, and what would be the overall cost to those involved? The CSIS ran the simulation an unprecedented 24 times just to make sure all the relevant data points were being properly considered. The first bombshell result of the report was that the invasion would not be a success for the PRC, but the cost to all involved would be horrific. According to CNN, extrapolating from an early preview of the report, a successful win from Taiwan was facilitated by 4 consistent factors across all models. Taiwan's ground forces must be able to contain Chinese beachheads, the US must be able to use its bases in Japan for combat operations, The US must have long-range anti-ship missiles to hit the PLA Navy from afar and en masse, and the US needs to fully arm Taiwan before shooting starts and jump into any conflict with its own forces immediately. But a victory doesn't mean a lack of fallout on all sides. The report stated, the United States and Japan lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of service members. Such losses would damage the US global position for many years. According to the majority of simulations, 3,200 US soldiers would die in the opening weeks of the conflict, and the US would also lose 2 aircraft carriers and 10 to 20 large surface combatants during the battles in the Taiwan Strait. But this is not to imply that China would be unscathed. According to the CSIS report, China also suffers heavily. Its navy is in shambles, the core of its amphibious forces is broken, and tens of thousands of soldiers become prisoners of war. On top of all that, data from the study suggest that 10,000 Chinese troops would die, and 155 combat aircraft and 138 major ships would also be lost. Japan, who would side with the US and Taiwan, would lose over 100 combat aircraft and 26 warships, as well as suffer home territory damage from Chinese attacks on the US military bases on their soil. Taiwan, even though most models predict it retaining its sovereignty, would still suffer some pretty horrific losses under basically all scenarios. According to the report, while Taiwan's military is unbroken, it is severely degraded and left to defend a damaged economy on an island without electricity and basic services. The nation's army would likely suffer around 3,500 casualties, along with the destruction of their entire navy. It also goes without saying that given the majority of the ground fighting would be in Taiwan, infrastructural and collateral damage is basically inevitable. We've already highlighted comparisons made between the potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the CSIS report and related experts also want to stress certain vital differences. Many academics and military officials have suggested that China may observe and learn from certain operational errors made by Russia, but if this report is to be believed, the same won't be true for Taiwan and the US. The report claims there will be no Ukraine model for NATO conduct in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, meaning that it'll be unfeasible to turn the invasion into an indirect proxy war, where Taiwan can be discreetly fed weapons and supplies. According to Mark Kansian, one of the CSIS project leaders, once the war begins, it's impossible to get any troops or supplies into Taiwan. So it's a very different situation from Ukraine, where the United States and its allies have been able to send supplies continuously to Ukraine. Whatever the Taiwanese are going to fight the war with, they have to have that when the war begins. But let's not get carried away with the idea that war is an inevitability, because according to CSIS, it simply isn't the case. Why? Because the PRC is just as aware as anyone else that an invasion of Taiwan could be their ultimate ruin. Dan Grazier, a senior defense policy fellow at the Project on Government Oversight, also known by the oddly whimsical acronym POGO, echoed the sentiments of the UK's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and his US counterpart, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, by saying that China's risk of total economic collapse may keep them from ever escalating to a full military invasion. Grazier stated, "The Chinese are going to do everything they can, in my estimation, to avoid a military conflict with anybody." Grazier's estimation is based on the fact that China's economy rests on the undisrupted flow of imports and exports. Interrupting continuous trade would quickly wreak havoc on the Chinese economy, with exports from their manufacturing sector being the backbone of their international influence. And the importation of food and fuel is vital to keep the very engine of their economy chugging along. Any disruption to the flow of these goods would be catastrophic. Even so, there's another model predicting that an invasion of Taiwan might be the PRC cutting off its nose to spite its own face. The CSIS report stated, the Chinese leadership might adopt a strategy of diplomatic isolation, gray zone pressure, or economic coercion against Taiwan. Diplomatic isolation and economic coercion are self-explanatory, but gray zone pressure may require a bit more of an explanation. In geopolitical terms, the gray zone is everything between a state of true peace and active war. Cyber attacks, election interference, propaganda, and spies. In other words, everything China has already been doing. As we discussed earlier, while Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party wants to preserve the sovereignty of the ROC, all it would take is one election to put a figurehead more sympathetic to the interests of Beijing into power and change everything. Why would Xi Jinping and the PRC risk it all in a dangerous and unpredictable war when they can maneuver their way into power far more delicately, even if it extends the timeline? though an important caveat was added by Mark Kansian, who stated, "Wars happen even when objective analysis might indicate the attacker might not be successful. Even global superpowers are made up of fallible people whose decision-making abilities are subject to the same biases and fallacies as anyone else. Even the knowledge of a potential collapse of their own economy and the devastation of their own military might not be enough to stop the People's Republic of China from trying to achieve the Chinese dream by any means necessary." From vast frozen expanses to isolated island nations, if you were looking to invade a country, which nation would be the easiest? Some might seem obvious, but others might surprise you. Let's just hope your country isn't on the list. Greenland is the largest island on the planet, yet it's surprising just how easy this nation would be to invade. The country technically governs itself, but it still has close ties to Denmark. The interesting thing is that Denmark is responsible for the defense of the island, as Greenland doesn't have its own military. Now, to be fair, Greenland is covered by one of the world's largest glaciers, and most of the country sits in the Arctic. So there aren't a lot of reasons why someone would want to invade the island. But if they did, the invading force would practically be able to walk right in. The border of Greenland is so massive that even if there was an active military presence in the country, there would be no way to defend all the coastline. Once on the mainland of Greenland, there would be some unique challenges in getting around, but an invading force that planned ahead for cold, snowy conditions would do just fine. Greenland actually just recently passed its Self-Government Act in 2009, so the country itself is still relatively young in terms of making its own major decisions. This would also make invading the country easier, as it's never had to make its own choices during wartime. And when fighting a war, one of the most important assets is experience, which Greenland has very little of. Denmark still has control over several aspects of the government in Greenland. This includes foreign and financial policies as well as strategic defense. If an invading force were to land on Greenland, Denmark would need to mobilize and send troops to the aid in fighting the enemy threat. And two countries aren't super close together, so this would take time. And since Greenland is so massive, it'd be hard for Denmark to decide where to even begin sending troops. Basically, if anyone wanted to invade Greenland, they wouldn't meet much resistance. That being said, holding the country once the invasion was complete would be a different matter. The landscape can be brutal, not to mention that at some point NATO would want to step in and help Greenland, so invading a nation would be easy, but holding it indefinitely would be next to impossible. Haiti is located in the Caribbean on an island it shares with the Dominican Republic. For various reasons, this country would also be easy to invade. The weather here poses much less of a challenge than in Greenland, as long as it isn't hurricane season. If an invader wanted to land their forces on the beaches of Haiti, there would be very little the country could do to stop them. For many years, Haiti's own military interfered with elections and threw coups. Therefore, the Haitian military was disbanded in 1995. The army was re-established in 2017 and consists of roughly 500 soldiers, which, combined with the 15,000 people who make up the Haiti National Police, would be the only resistance the invading force would encounter as they swept across the nation. Once the National Police and the small group of soldiers were taken care of, the invading force would be free to subdue any uprisings in their newly conquered territory and lay claim to whatever they wanted. Unfortunately, Haiti still has some corruption in their political systems, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that people within the government would see an opportunity to help the invading force just to make a profit or bolster their power. Most Haitians would fight for their country, but there is actually a bigger problem than having no military and corrupt officials if Haiti needed to fend off an invasion. In recent years, the country has been ravished by natural disasters such as earthquakes and hurricanes. In fact, Haiti is still recovering from these tragedies. This means that they do not have the infrastructure to fight off an invading force, even if they could somehow mobilize an impromptu military. As we've seen from the responses of other countries during times of crisis, help can be slow. Most of the time, it's the non-profit organizations that provide relief, and in times of war, they wouldn't be much help. The UN presence in Haiti has diminished over the years, even though they were the main peacekeeping force for the nation. Sometimes it seems the other countries and organizations tend to forget about Haiti and its people in times of need. We like to think that powerful countries in the region would come to their aid, but since Haiti doesn't have an abundance of resources or wealth, it's a very real possibility that they'd have to fight off an invading force on their own. Since they have no military and very limited law enforcement, Haiti would be an easy country to invade, and perhaps more importantly, one that could be held for an extended period of time. For our next easy-to-invade country, we'll head a little further south to Costa Rica. This country hasn't had a military since 1949, which is a long time when you think about it. Yet, they haven't had to worry too much about being invaded, as the country has some very powerful friends, most notably the US. Nevertheless, if a country did decide to invade Costa Rica, it wouldn't be too difficult at first. The country is straddled by the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, meaning that if an invading force planned it right, they could invade both sides of the country simultaneously, and then meet in the middle. Since Costa Rica doesn't have a navy, there'd be nothing to stop the invaders from coming by sea. And Costa Rica's police force is even smaller than Haiti's, with only around 10,000 officers. This means that once an invading force makes its way onto the mainland of the country, there would be very little resistance encountered, as long as the invaders make arrangements with Nicaragua and Panama first to ensure they don't intervene. It would be a long time before Costa Rica received any help from their allies. Costa Rica has a decent infrastructure due to its close ties with the United States and the large number of expats living there. Once the invaders land on the shore and take care of the small force of state police, they have a country that's pretty much able to maintain itself. This means they could use their newly captured resources, lands, and labor supply to prepare for what was to come. Eventually, the United States would intervene. It might take some time, but Costa Rica and the US are too close for there not to be a military force sent to aid Costa Rica. When this happens, the invaders are going to be in for a world of hurt. Costa Rica could easily be invaded, and the invaders would likely have some time to enjoy their spoils. But in the end, the United States would step in and the enemy would be decimated. There is one country that's been invaded time and time again, which kind of suggests it's easy to occupy. Throughout history, Poland always seems to find itself on the wrong end of an invasion. And why is this? Is the country really that easy to invade? The answer is yes and no. One of the things that makes Poland so enticing to invaders isn't necessarily its weak military, but its location. In the past, Poland always seemed to be in the middle of warring powers, or next to a country that desired to expand their own lands. Not only have Poland's neighbors been less than respectful of the country's boundaries, but the nation itself doesn't really have much in the way of natural defenses. Poland is relatively flat, and the only major water access is the Baltic. An invading force could ally itself with any of the countries surrounding Poland and would have easy access to the heartland of the country. The rude neighbors and power-hungry dictators are in the past for Poland. Today, it would be very much more difficult to invade the country because it is part of the European Union and NATO. However, there might still be a lingering fear of invasion in the back of every Pole's mind as a result of hundreds of years of being invaded and occupied by other countries. However, recently, Poland has announced plans to dramatically increase the size of its military by as much as twice as big. So check in next year and Poland may not be on this list anymore. There are pros and cons to being a small island nation when it comes to the threat of invasion. The pro is the country can be hard to get to, especially if it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The con is that if an invading force does come to your island, you are pretty much screwed. Take Tuvalu, for instance. This is a nation made up of 9 islands and is about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. When you look at a map, it's clear there's not a whole lot going on anywhere near Tuvalu except for miles and miles of ocean. This means that Tuvalu is a long way from help if they're invaded. Tuvalu has no military and very little police presence. It would likely take only 1 or 2 ships full of soldiers to successfully overrun the country. If the invading force had military training and any sort of armored vehicles, there would be nothing that the local authorities could do to stop an invasion. The islands themselves are all tiny and could easily be occupied by a small group of armed forces, and since Tuvalu has the smallest GDP in the entire world, at just under $50 million in 2020, it would not be able to afford the resources necessary to fight a war. Again, the main thing that Tuvalu has going for it is its isolation. But there are also individuals who have enough money to hire an army of mercenaries that could invade the island if they wanted to. Just to put it in perspective, Elon Musk has over 5 times the net worth of the entire nation of Tuvalu. We're not saying Elon Musk is trying to invade Tuvalu, but we are saying he could if he wanted to. There's nothing wrong with having a small GDP, but if you're trying to fight off an invading force, money does help. After all, invading and holding Tuvalu would not be a difficult task for someone with money and access to trained soldiers. One final nation that would be easy to invade is made vulnerable by how far away it is from the country that's supposed to protect it. Aruba is technically under the protection of the Netherlands. The island nation has no military and the entire police force consists of around 650 individuals. If an invasion occurred, help from the Netherlands would be just over 4,900 miles away. This means that after the 650 law enforcement officers were dealt with, the invading force would have no one else to stop them, unless they encountered some unruly tourists, that is. One problem with invading Aruba would be the number of foreign citizens that the invaders would have to deal with. They wouldn't want to upset the other nations by holding their citizens hostage, so they'd have to find a way to return all the foreigners to their home countries to avoid a conflict. After that, the occupation of Aruba would be smooth sailing. The island already has extravagant hotels and beautiful beaches, and since the military force responsible for protecting the nation is almost 5,000 miles away, the invaders would have full access to the island and all of its amenities for quite some time. Now, we know that in every one of these invasion scenarios mentioned, there would be an international outcry. This would force NATO, the United Nations, and other forces to mobilize to help the country being invaded. However, depending on the nation, it could take time. Costa Rica would receive aid much quicker than Tuvalu would. So if you're looking to invade a country and hold it for an extended period of time, the isolated islands of the Pacific Ocean are probably the way to go. Australia needs to prepare itself for a war with China within the next 3 years or face the possibility of complete Chinese domination. This was the message delivered by Red Alert, a report published jointly by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, which warned that war with China isn't just a possibility, it could be an inevitability. But what Australian citizens don't currently realize is that this impending war would have very little to do with Australia itself. Yes, China has expressed concern over the increasing number of military training operations that Australia is running alongside the United States and the United Kingdom, but those alone aren't reason enough for Beijing to invade. No, the reason why Australia could get drawn into a conflict with China has to do with an entirely different country, Taiwan. So what does Taiwan have to do with the possibility of war breaking out between Australia and China in the next few years? Are there any indications that this war might not actually happen? And if it does, is Australia adequately prepared to defend itself from Xi Jinping's devastating forces? Those are the questions we seek to answer in this video. We'll start with Taiwan. It's no secret that Jinping has designs on unifying Taiwan with China. The subject has been a part of his rhetoric for years as he plays on the nationalistic pride and the prevailing opinion within China that Taiwan is essentially a state that China owns, regardless of the Taiwanese desire to stay independent. Of course, Taiwan disputes this, and its allegiance with the United States is intended, at least in part, to serve as a deterrent to Chinese aggression. But that aggression is coming. In his 2023 New Year's Eve address to China, Jinping was perhaps more bullish than usual when discussing his intentions for Taiwan. According to the BBC, he reiterated past claims he's made that Taiwan would surely be reunified with the People's Republic of China. Only this time his tone was different from when he delivered a similar message in his 2022 address. Back then, he referred to Taiwan as a Chinese family member, essentially striking the tone of a concerned relative who simply wants to bring Taiwan back in from the cold after it's had its period of rebellion. The 2023 address contained no mentions of family. Instead, it came amidst the backdrop of increased Chinese military operations within the Taiwan Strait, made even more notable by the fact that Taiwan's elections were just 14 days away at the time he made the speech. Perhaps Jinping was attempting to use his words, alongside his military posturing, to convince Taiwan to elect a government that aligned better with his vision of what Taiwan should be. For its part, Taiwan rejected China's efforts to spurn its ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, which won the election and will now serve in its third straight term in power. That win is notable because the DPP has made clear its desire to keep Taiwan independent. Nevertheless, that didn't stop Jinping from flexing his military muscle in the weeks and months leading up to the election. In December 2023, Taiwan reported that it had seen several Chinese aircraft and warships drawing close to the island via the Taiwan Strait. Some even crossed the Davis Line, an unofficial median line that splits the Taiwan Strait into two and essentially serves as the seabound border between the two nations. Taiwan sent its own forces to monitor the situation, and a Chinese attack didn't occur. Taiwan instead suggested that Beijing was running combat readiness operations. The report came on the back of a similar incursion by China in November, which saw 9 of Jinping's aircraft fly over the Davis Line, accompanied by warships. That's not all. According to an AP News report from September 2023, Taiwan has also identified China is bolstering its numerous military bases that it has run along the coastline facing Taiwan. According to Major General Huan Wenxi, a member of the General Staff for Intelligence of Taiwan's Defense Ministry, Taipei has received intelligence suggesting these bases are being continuously updated. In particular, he highlighted a trio of Chinese air bases, Longtian, Zhangzhou, and Hui'an, as having been subjects of recent expansion efforts. Throw that all together with the repeated exercises China carries out in the Taiwan Strait, several surpassing the Davis Line, and it's clear that Beijing is gearing up for something. That something is likely a war with Taiwan within the next couple years. But by now, you likely have a question in mind: what does any of this have to do with Australia? The answer comes from an article published in the Sydney Morning Herald in June 2022 that claimed Australia was at very serious risk of war with China within the next 5 years. In that article, a former Australian senior defense and intelligence official named Ross Babbage claimed that any war over Taiwan would likely draw in American forces to protect Taipei's independence, and therein lies the issue for Australia. If America enters a war in Taiwan, Australia would have to support that war. Babbage was quick to point out that Jinping's window of opportunity for an invasion of Taiwan is closing, meaning that the prospect of Chinese movement in the next few years is very real. In short, if Jinping doesn't launch an invasion now, he will give Taiwan too much time to prepare, in addition to welcoming more American defenses that could thwart his efforts. And then he goes on to say that it was almost inconceivable that Australia would refuse to join the United States should the latter have to launch a military operation in defense of Taiwan. And the reason comes down to the ANZUS Treaty. Signed by Australia, New Zealand, and the United States in 1951, the treaty is an agreement between all three nations to work together to protect the security of the Pacific region. Interestingly, that treaty is somewhat malleable. As the U.S. Department of Defense points out, the U.S. and New Zealand no longer maintain a security-related relationship, though it's also important to point out that the treaty hasn't been formally abrogated. In other words, it's still signed and in effect, with a lack of abrogation, meaning it hasn't been written out of the law. While New Zealand seemingly isn't working with the United States to bolster its defenses, the same can't be said of Australia. According to ABC News, while New Zealand seems to be distancing itself from the U.S., Australia is drawing ever closer. In July 2023, ABC reported on a new agreement signed between the two countries in which America will increase its rotational presence throughout Australia. That cooperation would include more frequent visits by U.S. submarines to Australia's western bases, in addition to Australia granting America deeper access to its air bases in the north and west of the country. In return, the U.S. will also work with Australia to speed up its efforts to improve its guided missile production capabilities, as well as help it deepen its security relationships with another country under threat of China, Japan. In a news conference to commemorate the agreement, America's Secretary of State Antony Blinken even made a subtle mention of the alliance's purpose. Our two countries are defending the international rules-based order, which has underwritten peace and security for decades, he said. More tellingly, he pointed out that the maintenance of this order ensures that both countries will be able to make its own sovereign decisions free from any coercion. Neither Taiwan nor China were mentioned. In fact, the quote refers specifically to Australian and American sovereignty, but it's not hard to read the subtext behind the mention of coercion, which is clearly a reference to what he sees as China's destabilizing efforts in the Pacific region. The spirit of cooperation doesn't end there. In December 2023, the UK newspaper The Guardian reported that the United States Congress had passed legislation allowing the sale of several of its AUKUS nuclear submarines to Australia. These Virginia-class subs would likely serve as a counter for Chinese naval efforts should Australia be drawn into a war, though the sale won't take place for some time. According to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, the transfer of subs would still require the president, whoever that might be at the time of a sale, to sign off. Still, many commentators see the NDAA as a way for Australia to strengthen its navy with American assistance by equipping it with a small fleet of nuclear submarines in the 2030s as it prepares to start building its own subs in the 2040s. The ties between Australia and the United States run deep. Now think about what that means in the context of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Back in September of 2022, President Joe Biden said in no uncertain terms that American forces would defend Taiwan if China invaded, though he backtracked on those statements a little later on. It's clear that Biden understands the threat a Chinese invasion would present and will do everything in his power to thwart Beijing's ambitions. Who do you think he'll call upon when the time comes? Australia. The deepening of military ties between Australia and the United States isn't a one-way street. While Australia gets access to nuclear submarines and more internal defenses, thanks to a bolstered American presence, it's also placed itself in a position where it can't say no if the United States comes calling. The former leader of the Australian Labor Party, Kim Beazley, points this out in quotes published in the Sydney Morning Herald. He claims that Australia is now in a position where it is totally dependent on the United States for defense, meaning the U.S. would likely expect Australia to commit naval and air assets to the war effort should Taiwan become a problem. On top of that, the increased access to northern military bases that Australia granted the U.S. in its most recent military agreement would come to bear. America would funnel tens of thousands of troops through those bases, using them as launching points for counteroffensives against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. How do you think Beijing will respond to all of this? Naturally, it would view Australia as a powerful threat to its Taiwanese ambitions and would take measures that could lead to a larger war. Granted, those measures may be subtle at first. According to Babbage, Australia would see very heavy cyber attacks right up front, rather than a full invasion by Chinese soldiers. He also speculated on the possibility of China taking advantage of sleeper cells it has installed in Australia, potentially to give it access to military bases and wreak havoc. Even more worryingly, Babbage claims those bases are not heavily defended at the moment, giving China a potential inroad to causing issues for Australia without ever setting foot on its shores. The Red Alert report mentioned at the beginning of this video generally concurs with what Babbage is saying. That report, written by a quintet of respected military experts that included Levina Lee, a senior lecturer at Macquarie University, claims that Australia may see an influx of up to 200,000 American troops if Beijing makes a grab for Taiwan. Similar to Babbage, the five believe that this would result in Chinese cyber attacks on critical Australian infrastructure. However, they also argue that Chinese missiles could rain down on Australia in response to its cooperation with the United States, both to damage Australia itself and to cause issues for American troops using the country as a base to launch its offensives. Those missiles are a terrifying prospect, but they could become a reality depending on the American response to China's impending invasion of Taiwan. Even more worrying is that these same military experts warned of an abuse of urgency related to the measures that Australia needs to take right now to defend itself against Chinese attacks. The Red Alert report warned that Australia needs to undertake a dramatic strengthening of its military capabilities, in addition to achieving a psychological shift that will see its current complacency replaced with urgency to prepare for the war. In short, the decades of peace with China are on the verge of coming to an end. Australia needs to be prepared, but it isn't. Think back to when we mentioned that Kim Beazley believes Australia is totally dependent on the US and its military in the event of a war. He made that statement during the launch of Ross Babbage's book, The Next Major War: Can the US and its Allies Win Against China? On top of that belief, Beazley went on to state that successive Australian governments had utterly failed to confront the Chinese threat, resulting in them dropping the ball on defense spending over the last 3 decades. According to Beazley, Australia needs to be spending at least $5 billion more, likely closer to $8 billion on its defenses every year than it currently spends. And it's hard to argue against his point. Over the last 5 years, Australian military spending has been mostly stagnant, though yo-yoing slightly between increases and decreases. Macro Trends says the budget declined in both 2018 and 2019, with Australia spending 3.07% and 2.83% less in those years, respectively. Increases followed in 2020 and 2021, with the latter seeing a sharp uptick of 16.31%, but 2022 saw another decrease, with Statista saying that Australia spent 1.9% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense, compared to 1.99% in 2022. With 2023 has come another increase, this time bringing the budget to around $35 billion, which is the highest it's been since the $31.75 billion spent in 2021. But given the global effects inflation has had, it's unlikely this extra couple of billion will grant Australia much more spending power than it had in 2021. Now contrast those figures with China's military spending. Where Australian military spending has stagnated, China's spending has skyrocketed. Beijing's march toward military modernization has led to it becoming the world's second highest defense spender, only beaten by the United States. According to Reuters, Beijing upped its military spending by 7.2% in 2023, an aggressive strategy that saw the increase outpace the country's anticipated 5% GDP growth. This increase amounted to $224 billion for the year, which is about 4 times what Australia spent. And that's not all. China's actual military budget may be much larger than it appears, due to simple cost differences. For instance, a Chinese soldier gets paid about a quarter of what an American soldier receives, according to foreign policy, meaning Beijing can hire 4 soldiers for the price of 1 American. It'll be a similar situation in Australia, wherein the country has to deal with the fact that not only is China spending more, but every Chinese dollar spent goes further than every Australian dollar. Compare China and Australia's military strength, and the gulf becomes even more obvious. According to Global Firepower, China comes out on top in every single category. Its 2 million troop military is 35 times the size of Australia's. China's air force is 10 times larger than Australia's, and it has thousands more tanks, armored vehicles, and general land battle assets. Even China's navy far surpasses Australia's. China has a fleet of 730 ships, compared to the paltry 43 owned by Australia. Whether by land, sea, or air, Australia simply cannot defeat China. And therein lies another reason why war is coming. Once China attacks Taiwan and likely succeeds, it may start looking further afield. And with the justification that it's been provoked by Australia's hosting of American troops, along with the country's likely direct involvement in its war on Taiwan, it may turn its eye to its Pacific neighbor. Beijing will seize an opportunity. It'll see that Australia has underinvested in its military, as Beasley suggests. It may see the country as a fairly easy target, at least in terms of military strength, for invasion. The only thing that may stop the supposed red alert would be the presence of American forces, again reinforcing the notion that Australia has to rely on the United States for military protection. None of this is good news for Australia. In the next 3 years, it's faced with being dragged into a war that it likely wants no part of. As a consequence of entering that war, it may become the direct target of Chinese aggression, setting itself up for years of sounding the red alert the Sydney Morning Herald writes about, while trying to fend off the Chinese threat with an underpowered army and the help of a few allies. But there's another reason why Australia may have to go to war with China: semiconductors. Right now, Taiwan's the world's largest manufacturer of semiconductors. These essential components find their way into practically every modern electronic device, making their safe passage from Taiwan to every country that needs them essential. Without semiconductors, the medical, computing, military, communications, transportation, and energy sectors would all drop to their knees. And that's not just in Australia. Every country that uses electronics, i.e. every country in the world, would face massive supply chain issues if Taiwan were to fall to China. How massive? The Economist says that Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's standard semiconductors, along with a staggering 90% of the most advanced examples of the technology. It's also home to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC, which makes the majority of the country's semiconductor output. Imagine if Taiwan falls under Chinese control. In a heartbeat, China seizes one of the world's most important industries and can suddenly control the flow of semiconductors to the Western world. Beijing could decide to simply stop selling semiconductors to any country that it deems a threat, causing many of the country's major industries to stagnate while it simply grows in strength. That's a situation that Australia, along with the rest of the world, can't allow to become a reality. As a result, Australia may not be forced to interject in China's attempt to invade Taiwan. It may not be the unwilling participant in a counteroffensive that's spearheaded by its American partners. In reality, Australia may realize just how damaging it would be to its military and economy to allow China to control the majority of the world's semiconductor trade, thus entering the war simply to defend its own interests. With all of these factors in mind, it seems that war with China is an inevitability for Australia. But could that war be avoided? It's worth pointing out that Beasley and Babbage both believe that the true chances of entering a war with China in the next 5 years are about 50%. For all of the threat that Beijing poses, it's a possibility that Australia will attempt to stay neutral or, in the worst case, negotiate with China to keep itself safe while it watches Taiwan fall. Furthermore, the Australian people seem somewhat divided on how the country should react to the Taiwan issue. In June 2023, Reuters reported on the annual Lowy Institute poll, which examines the Australian people's attitude toward the rest of the world. That poll revealed that most of those surveyed, 82% of 6,000 respondents, believe that Australia's alliance with the United States is a good idea, which is likely an acknowledgement that Australian people know that their military couldn't stand up to China. However, about 75% of respondents also believe that this alliance means Australia would be drawn into a war in Asia, such as fighting over Taiwan, if the United States were to enter the battlefield. And to hammer the point home, 64% of those surveyed named the possibility of war between China and the United States over Taiwan as a critical threat, again revealing that the average Australian feels like war is coming. But herein lies the split. Though most Australians, 64% of them, would support sending military supplies and equipment to Taiwan if it were invaded, a slim majority say that Australia shouldn't get directly involved in the war itself. Opposition to sending Australian military personnel to Taiwan was expressed by 58% of people, with 56% saying that resuming diplomatic contact with China, or opening the doors for peace talks in the process, is in the country's best interests. One thing is for certain, Australians don't trust China. That same survey revealed that just 15% of Australians trust China to act responsibly in the world. That's a staggering decline from the nearly 50% who trusted Beijing just 5 years ago. Australian eyes are open to the threat China poses, even if a slim majority believe the country shouldn't get involved directly in Beijing's impending war on Taiwan. But frankly, Australia may have no choice. Its alliance with the United States, though wonderful for defending itself, also means that Australia will likely have to take up arms if the US comes calling for support. Australia, like many other countries, will also be wary of allowing China to take control of the majority of the world's semiconductor trade. and it'll want to show that it's no pushover if China sees an opportunity for invasion. Ultimately, Australia going to war may be out of the country's hands. Everything hinges on China's approach to Taiwan over the next 3 years, and crucially, the United States' response if China decides to invade the island nation it already believes it owns. India and China are on the verge of war, and any day now the shooting could start. Just a few short decades ago, the idea of the two most populous nations going to war seemed preposterous. China and India were both leaders of the non-aligned movement, naturally after China broke up with the Soviet Union in a messy divorce. Both nations saw the power struggle taking place between the Soviet Union and the United States and wished to remain free of influence from both superpowers, and to keep other smaller nations around them similarly free of that influence. Things didn't quite go to plan, and China found out there were significant benefits to being BFFs with the big kid on the block. However, India and China's relationship began to sour long before this, mostly over territorial disputes, chief amongst them being the fate of Tibet. India viewed Tibet as a natural buffer between itself and China, with an eye to the future, wished to annex Tibet so as to control the all-important headwaters of various rivers critical to China's well-being. The ensuing annexation also placed China on the military high ground, so to speak, a significant advantage it enjoys to this day. Disputes over where the actual territorial boundary of each nation lay added fuel to the fire, but it was India giving political asylum to the Dalai Lama which effectively destroyed Indian and Chinese relations. This would result in a border war between the two powers in 1962, which saw the Chinese secure advantageous positions along the northern disputed border but was limited in scope and fighting. When Pakistan went to war with India in 1965, China backed Pakistan and threatened to push the issue of its territorial conflicts with India. In 1967, India got its revenge with two different border clashes that favored India this time. China turned to financing political extremists inside of India, especially dissident groups in northeastern India. In 1971, India and Pakistan took up their favorite pastime and once more declared war on each other, with China once more backing Pakistan and even threatening to join the conflict on Pakistan's side. However, by the end of the decade, both sides tried to kiss and make up, with both nations turning a blind eye to possible human rights abuses carried out by the other in their own territory. The Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs exchanged visits to each other's capitals, a landmark move that signaled closer ties ahead for the two most populated nations on Earth. However, the friendship was not meant to be, as both sides once more began to reinforce their shared border and make strategic moves to gain local advantages over the other. In 1987, most people believed war was inevitable, but after a series of border clashes, ultimately both sides backed away from what would turn into a highly destructive war. Going into the 1990s, China and India once more attempted to reset relations, setting up a task force to troubleshoot border disputes and engaging in mutual rounds of military de-escalation along the border. Consulates for each other's nations reopened in 1992, and both sides signed cooperation agreements on issues ranging from trade to global warming and combating animal extinctions. Then in 1998, India undertook a series of nuclear tests, which China strongly condemned. Indian Defense Minister George Fernandez made it clear that India's nuclear arsenal was primarily to defend from China, stating that China was enemy number one for India. Relations between the two sides quickly soured, with China once more supporting Pakistan in the 1999 Kargil War. Relations would remain rocky between the two throughout the 2000s and 2010s, though steadily worsening and topping off with a border clash in 2020 that led to 11 soldiers being injured. A month later, another clash would leave 20 Indian troops dead and an unknown number of Chinese troops killed. Both sides had agreed not to carry firearms to lower the risk of accidental conflict, so the ensuing border clashes, and more to come afterwards, were undertaken with everything from homemade clubs and spears to riot batons. India would go on to ban 59 Chinese apps, citing espionage concerns, and crack down on Chinese spying inside the country. Then in October of 2020, India made the unprecedented move of signing a cooperation agreement with the United States. Not a treaty, this simple agreement lays out the foundation of what would eventually turn into a full-blown mutual defense treaty, and it puts India on the path of becoming one of the US's many global allies. To say that China was upset about this would be to put it mildly. What would come next, though, would result in a litany of diplomatic protests. India would look to secure its one geographic advantage over China by building up military installations on islands in the Indian Ocean. with a major base being developed on the Mauritian Islands. This will allow India to effectively choke off Chinese shipping through the Indian Ocean, through which travels most of China's oil imports and a great deal of its international exports. From multiple points in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy and Air Force are looking to shut down Chinese trade in the case of a war and limit the ability of the Chinese Navy to operate in the Indian Ocean. But China is fighting back, building up its own military installation on an island off the coast of Myanmar. Satellite imagery recently revealed a 2,300-meter runway as well as multiple housing and maintenance facilities. It's believed that ultimately it'll serve as a signals intelligence base for the Chinese military, though the lengthy runway means it'll be able to operate heavy aircraft from it as well, threatening the Indian Navy from the skies. India is going to need every advantage it can get against China because it's lagging significantly behind in just about every metric. The Indian military is suffering from a modernity crisis, with many of its weapon systems aging out and no replacements in the pipeline. For decades, India has attempted to stay neutral between the Soviet Union and then Russia and the United States in the West. This gave the country access to both sides' military exports, but by not choosing sides, neither was willing to let India get its top-shelf stuff. That is, until Russia needed India's money to build a fifth-generation fighter, only for India to ultimately pull out of the Su-57 project when it realized it would be unable to do anything it was advertised to do, and not be a competitor to the US F-22 or F-35. This neutrality might have served it politically, though that's arguable, but it has left India to basically shop for military hardware in the bargain bin. Attempts to kickstart a domestic arms industry have so far not gone to plan, with the development of the Arjun tank taking decades and delivering a product Indian tankers themselves consider substandard. Without strong defense partnerships, India is now attempting to build a fifth-generation fighter to eventually be upgraded to a sixth-gen, but the entire program is still on the drawing board and unlikely to get very far. India has many talented engineers, but the nation simply lacks the experience of a mature aerospace industry like many military heavyweights in the West have. This is the reason why India has been looking to get chummy with the US lately, with the nation joining the now famous Quad. This informal organization made up of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia is focused on South Pacific security, mostly geared toward containing China. For India, the U.S. offers a mature, robust military-industrial complex and the opportunity to equip itself adequately against a currently far superior Chinese force. For the U.S., India is a natural partner as a fellow democracy and is strategically poised to deliver a death blow to the Chinese trade in case of war, a natural deterrent to said war. The Chinese military is pound for pound far better equipped than the Indian military. A steady upgrade program has resulted in an Air Force that's over half modern, while the Indian Air Force is struggling to keep aging airframes combat ready. To add to India's problem, China is the third nation in the world to field a fifth-generation fighter, though the J-20 is largely considered a low observable and not a true stealth platform. With 200 in service and more being added every year, however, India's Air Force would struggle significantly against the far superior Chinese forces. China's defense industry is also more developed than India, even if it's better at stealing and copying technology than actually developing and innovating on its own. Given that a significant part of the developed world sees China as a potential threat to the global order, nations have increasingly been reluctant to give China access to their advanced manufacturing techniques. Also because they inevitably will try to steal them. This leaves China wholly reliant on Western, Japanese, and South Korean manufacturing equipment for high-precision tooling, and these countries are increasingly tamping down on the access China has to their machines. Despite this, China's defense industry is far more mature than India's and poses a significant threat in the coming decades as it gains more and more experience. This is why closer partnerships with the US and the West on the whole are so important to India, and part of its strategy to checkmate China. India and the US are steadily improving their partnership, with both sides holding multiple joint exercises. In 2022, Indian and American Special Forces undertook a series of exercises in Hawaii, and the India-US Defense Acceleration Ecosystem, or INDES-X, aims to tie the two nations even closer together through joint development of key technologies. Part of INDES-X is the United States assisting India with technical expertise and money in the building of new logistical hubs, as well as repair and maintenance infrastructure for the Indian Air Force and the Navy. The United States has rapidly become one of India's major military suppliers, as well as its largest military exercise partner, with multiple joint training exercises undertaken by both sides. India is getting the advantage of learning how to fight like the US, while for the US, a strong India means a stable and peaceful South Pacific. There is significant work toward allowing India access to top-shelf American military technology as well. While no high-profile transfers are in the works just yet, the two sides are agreeing to cooperate on a number of technologies. India has a huge number of highly skilled engineers and computer scientists, which the U.S. companies could put to great use. In exchange, these same professionals would gain invaluable experience they could take back home with them to jumpstart joint U.S.-Indian efforts. Two further foundational defense agreements have been signed between the two nations, with a focus on joint force interoperability and intelligence sharing. The agreement set the stage for both sides learning how to operate alongside each other's forces, much in the same way that NATO forces operate jointly. Intelligence sharing will greatly increase both sides' ability to counter Chinese influence in the region, especially in its efforts to destabilize India politically or carry out acts of industrial sabotage or theft. However, the future is not all roses for an American-Indian relationship. The U.S. has recently developed significant concerns over a growing trend of undemocratic activities by Indian politicians and has equal concerns about India's ability to maintain the type of defense spending that a joint partnership would require. India's enduring ties with Russia, despite the latter's illegal invasion of Ukraine and continued campaign of war crimes, further strained U.S.-Indian relations, and concerns that India might be the wrong partner for America have recently begun to surface on the other side of the Pacific. Lately, India has also proven to be slow to respond to Chinese provocations on its own border, which concerns American military planners who fear a radical shift in India toward the appeasement of China, putting at jeopardy joint defense ventures between the two sides. The U.S. would like to see India address its increasing authoritarianism and move back toward more liberal values. There are also significant concerns over India's either inability or unwillingness to tackle a massive scam industry within its own borders, with Indian scammers stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. and other Western nations each year. On many occasions, these scammers have completely avoided prosecution or simply had a blind eye turned to them by corrupt police, despite Western law enforcement bringing evidence of their activities to Indian authorities. Scammers remain a significant strain on the honor of the Indian people and a major roadblock to further deepening ties between India and any potential Western partners. With India staging its forces closer to strategically important waterways like the Straits of Malacca, the nation is set to gain the ultimate upper hand over China. However, with Chinese military capabilities growing at an exponential rate relative to itself, India needs partnerships with other global powers more than ever. How it chooses to pursue those partnerships and how committed to them it remains will dictate the future of India and its people. Now go check out India's World War III plan or click this other video instead.